intentionally. Blank page paradox. Imagine a scenario where you take a slice of bread, butter it on one side, and then drop it. The buttered side will likely land face down. But what if you then take a cat, butter its back, and drop it as well? According to the buttered cat paradox, the cat will land on its feet, and the buttered side of the bread will always land butter side down. But what happens when you combine the two? You end up with a buttered cat, a paradox where the cat and the bread seem to create an infinite loop of falling and spinning, with each object cancelling out the other's natural tendencies. This humorous yet thought-provoking paradox has fascinated many as a quirky blend of Murphy's Law and randomness. Can order, the cat landing on its feet, and chaos, the bread always landing butter side down, exist simultaneously? Could this paradox be more than just a playful thought experiment, suggesting deeper philosophical implications about determinism, randomness, and chaos theory? Let's explore the buttered cat paradox, where randomness and the laws of nature collide in an absurd yet strangely captivating way. The buttered cat paradox is a humorous thought experiment that plays on two well-known ideas, Murphy's Law and the laws of physics. Murphy's Law, which states, anything that can go wrong will go wrong, suggests that things have a tendency to break down or fall in a way that is least convenient. Meanwhile, the laws of physics, particularly the idea that a cat always lands on its feet, are part of a long-standing curiosity about the natural world's behavior under force or gravity. The paradox itself likely emerged as a humorous take on the two contrasting principles, one that suggests order, the cat's ability to land on its feet, and the other that suggests chaos, the buttered bread always landing butter side down. In fact, the paradox was popularized as an internet meme in the early 2000s, where the absurd image of a buttered cat spinning in mid-air to perpetuate both law-like phenomena became a widely circulated joke. Though there are no serious scientific implications tied to the paradox, it reflects common philosophical debates about determinism and chaos. The buttered cat paradox is often viewed as a playful twist on cause and effect, asking the question, can two natural laws that seem to contradict each other coexist in the same universe? Despite being a light-hearted example of randomness and perception, the paradox also challenges us to consider how we interpret contradictory events and the sometimes unpredictable nature of the world. The buttered cat paradox is a humorous yet insightful thought experiment that examines the collision of Murphy's Law and natural law. It presents an image of chaos and order existing simultaneously, raising interesting questions about randomness, gravity, and even philosophical concepts like determinism and free will. The buttered cat paradox hinges on the classic principle of Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. This idea suggests that life is filled with unintended consequences, especially in chaotic and random events. In the case of the paradox, Murphy's Law implies that when a slice of bread is buttered on one side and dropped, the buttered side will almost always land down. This is the expected failure, based on the fact that gravity and physical forces often act in ways that favour unintended outcomes. In a broader sense, Murphy's Law applies to everyday life, where events tend to go wrong or unpredictably. The paradox amplifies this concept to a ridiculous level, where the combination of two independent laws, the cat always landing on its feet and the buttered bread landing butter side down, results in a nearly impossible scenario. The image of the buttered cat spinning endlessly highlights the absurdity of randomness and chaos in the natural world. On the other side of the paradox lies the law of gravity and the cat's reflexes. According to this principle, a cat always lands on its feet, regardless of the height or orientation from which it falls. This is an example of a biomechanical reflex that allows the cat to quickly adjust its body in mid-air, ensuring that it lands safely. This law introduces order and predictability into the scenario. The cat's landing behavior is controlled by a complex set of reflexes that depend on balance, muscle tension, and the ability to align its body for a safe landing. This ability has been studied and shown to be a crucial survival mechanism for felines, allowing them to survive falls from great heights. The paradox arises when you combine the chaos of the buttered bread's behavior with the order of the cat's landing reflex. This creates a cyclic scenario, where the cat and bread become locked in a sequence of events that appear to contradict each other, challenging our typical notions of cause and effect. When we combine the two laws, the cat landing on its feet and the buttered bread falling butter side down, the paradox reveals an interesting twist. If you were to drop a buttered cat, the two forces would compete with each other. the cat's reflex to land on its feet, and the bread's tendency to fall butter side down. The absurdity emerges when we imagine the buttered cat spinning endlessly in the air, creating a loop of continuous falling without ever fully landing. This illustrates the concept of chaos, the unpredictable, random nature of events, when two forces of opposite tendencies are at play. The paradox reflects the absurdity of trying to control or predict a chaotic system. Even with perfect knowledge of gravity, physics, and biomechanics, the interaction of these two principles creates unresolvable randomness, demonstrating the limitations of human prediction in complex systems. Despite the chaos introduced by the paradox, the cat's reflexes represent order and stability. The cat, in this case, is seen as an embodiment of control and predictability, as its natural instinct ensures a safe landing in most situations. The paradox, however, complicates this by introducing an external force, the buttered bread, which continuously disrupts the expected result. This interplay between order and chaos challenges the notion of absolute determinism. If everything in the universe were completely predictable, we could trace every outcome to its cause. But the paradox of the buttered cat demonstrates how small, random variations can lead to unexpected results, defying our expectations and illustrating the imperfection of natural laws. The buttered cat paradox also invites reflection on the role of randomness in the universe. Much of modern physics and philosophy deals with the balance between order and chaos. Quantum mechanics, for example, has shown that the universe operates in a fundamentally random way at the microscopic level, where particles behave unpredictably. While large-scale phenomena like the cat landing on its feet may seem deterministic, the paradox highlights how randomness on the small scale can have surprising and often humorous consequences. This randomness challenges the notion that the universe is completely deterministic. The buttered cat paradox shows that even in a system governed by predictable laws, there is room for uncertainty and chaos. Just as the buttered cat might spin endlessly, we too are caught in a cycle of randomness that we cannot fully predict or control. On a deeper level, the paradox taps into philosophical debates about free will and determinism. If every action and outcome is determined by previous events and natural laws, then is our behavior also predictable? Or are we, like the buttered cat, caught in a loop of randomness and unpredictability? The cat's ability to land on its feet suggests agency and control, while the buttered bread's fall suggests the chaos of external forces. This duality raises the question of whether humans have true agency in a world filled with chaos and random events. The buttered cat paradox offers a humorous yet poignant metaphor for our attempts to navigate between order and chaos in our own lives. In the context of Murphy's Law, the buttered cat paradox is a metaphor for the way life often surprises us. Even when we try to plan and control our environment, the universe has a way of throwing us curveballs. Much like how the buttered cat behaves unpredictably, this paradoxical interaction highlights how life's chaos can undermine even the best-laid plans, forcing us to confront the randomness and unpredictability of existence. The paradox also challenges us to embrace life's randomness and imperfection. It suggests that while we may strive for order and predictability, we must also accept the inherent chaos and unpredictability that come with it. The buttered cat paradox serves as a playful reminder that, much like in the universe, not everything can be neatly explained or controlled. And that's okay. Metabasis paradox. Imagine you're in the middle of a heated argument, laying out your thoughts with precision and clarity. But just as your argument reaches its climax, you make a subtle shift, an unexpected transition that alters the entire direction of the conversation. The people around you can no longer follow your original reasoning, and your points seem to unravel. This is the metabasis paradox, when an argument changes direction so dramatically that the original reasoning becomes unclear, invalid, or irrelevant. How can we maintain logical consistency when making such shifts, especially in complex debates? The metabasis paradox highlights a fascinating dilemma in the world of logic and argumentation theory. When is it valid to shift gears in the course of an argument, and when does it become an unwarranted deviation that undermines the original claim? The paradox challenges our understanding of logical flow and reasoning, forcing us to ask whether it's possible to transition between ideas without losing the integrity of the argument. Let's explore the metabasis paradox. where the line between valid reasoning and fallacious reasoning becomes blurred as we move from one premise to the next. The metabasis paradox finds its roots in the study of argumentation theory and rhetoric. The concept of metabasis, also known as transitional reasoning, has long been a topic of discussion in logic, especially in the context of formal debate and philosophical argumentation. The term itself is derived from the Greek word metabasis, meaning transition or change, referring to the process of shifting from one idea to another in the course of an argument. In classical rhetorical theory, metabasis was seen as a strategic tool used by orators and philosophers to guide the audience's thinking from one position to another, often in the hope of making their argument appear more coherent or persuasive. However, in the realm of formal logic, such shifts are scrutinized, as they can lead to logical fallacies or undermine the integrity of an argument if not done carefully. The paradox arises when an unwarranted shift in reasoning makes the original argument seem incoherent, even if the transition was made in good faith. The metabasis paradox was first formally recognized in the 20th century as researchers began to explore the limits of formal logic and argumentation. Philosophers like Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, and Willard van Orman Quine explored how paradigm shifts and theoretical transitions in scientific and philosophical discourse could lead to paradoxes of logic where earlier positions no longer held. The metabasis paradox mirrors these shifts in the structure of reasoning, where transitions can cause logical breakdowns or unintended consequences. The metabasis paradox emerges from the tension between logical consistency and the freedom to shift between ideas and arguments. In theory, transitions in arguments should serve to clarify or strengthen the original claim. But in practice, such transitions can result in logical inconsistencies, especially when they are not carefully structured or clearly justified. In argumentation, transitions, or metabasis, serve an essential role in connecting different points or ideas within an argument. They allow an argument to flow smoothly from one premise to the next, providing a sense of continuity and coherence. Transitions help to guide the listener or reader from an initial claim to a conclusion, ensuring that each step is logically connected to the next. A well-constructed argument follows a logical progression, where each premise builds on the previous one, leading to a conclusion that follows naturally from the given evidence or reasoning. The goal of transitions is to maintain this coherence and ensure that the logic of the argument remains intact throughout. However, the metabasis paradox arises when these transitions go unjustified or too far in shifting the focus, leading to a breakdown in the logical flow. While transitions are useful for making an argument more compelling, the metabasis paradox points out the potential risks involved in making such shifts. If a transition is too abrupt or poorly justified, it can cause a logical fallacy known as a non sequitur. Literally, it does not follow. In this case, the conclusion may no longer follow logically from the premises, even though the transition might seem perfectly reasonable on the surface. The paradox is that a shift in argumentation can be both a legitimate and necessary move to address new perspectives or challenges in the debate. However, if not executed with precision, it can disconnect the argument from its original foundation, leaving the audience unable to follow the reasoning. A famous example of metabasis in a historical context is found in the scientific revolution, particularly in the shift from classical physics to quantum mechanics. When Isaac Newton's laws of motion were challenged by Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, and later by the discoveries of quantum mechanics, these paradigm shifts required significant transitions in how scientists viewed the physical world. While such shifts were necessary for scientific progress, they also exemplify the metabasis paradox. These transitions fundamentally altered the way evidence was interpreted, leading to logical contradictions between the old and new theories. For example, the relativity paradox in physics, where different observers see the same event differently, depending on their relative motion, challenges the coherence of classical mechanics, even though both theories work within their own domains. In this context, the transition from one paradigm to another creates a paradox, where previous knowledge is no longer fully applicable, yet the new knowledge still retains logical consistency within its own framework. This can be seen as a type of metabasis that introduces new reasoning structures, but also leads to logical dissonance when comparing them with previous models. In philosophy, the metabasis paradox can be seen in the works of great thinkers who shifted their ideas over time, causing their earlier works to appear inconsistent with their later theories. René Descartes, for instance, initially framed his philosophy around dualism, the mind and body as separate substances. Later, however, Descartes' reasoning around the mind-body connection shifted, causing tension between his earlier works and his later writings. Similarly, the transition between empiricism and rationalism throughout the history of philosophy introduces moments of metabasis, where earlier, more logical models are discarded in favor of new systems of thought that prioritize experience or reason over the other. Such shifts are often necessary for the development of new ideas, but raise questions about the validity of earlier frameworks, leading to paradoxes of consistency and coherence. An argument typically follows a structured form, where the premises logically support the conclusion. In some cases, an argument needs to change direction or adapt to new evidence, creating a metabasis, a shift from one line of reasoning to another. This shift can be driven by a change in context, the introduction of new evidence, or the need to address counter-argument. For example, in a debate about climate change, one side might start by focusing on empirical evidence showing a rise in global temperatures. As the debate progresses, the argument might shift to focus on economic solutions or technological innovations that could address climate change, even though the shift might appear disconnected from the original argument. This shift is a necessary transition, but it can sometimes feel like a digression if not handled with care. The metabasis paradox arises when these shifts are not clearly justified, leading to confusion or the perception that the original argument has lost its coherence. A logical transition should be seamless, but if it's abrupt or unexplained, it risks undermining the integrity of the entire argument. For a transition to be valid, it must be supported by the argument's structure and context. If a shift is made without introducing the necessary justification, it can lead to an invalid argument. The transition should connect the dots between the premises and conclusion without creating logical gaps. For instance, if a debater moves from a discussion about climate science to a focus on policy proposals without explaining why the two are related, the argument may lose its logical continuity. The validity of the transition depends on whether the change in reasoning is evidence-based and contextually relevant. The metabasis paradox challenges the balance between coherence and flexibility in argumentation. While maintaining logical coherence is essential for a strong argument, flexibility is also necessary when addressing new perspectives, counter-arguments, or unexpected evidence. However, too much flexibility can lead to a lack of cohesion, making the argument appear inconsistent or contradictory. The paradox asks us to consider, how can we maintain coherence while being open to new ideas or shifting directions? The answer lies in logical transitions. Carefully structured, well-explained shifts that allow for the incorporation of new information while still maintaining integrity. The metabasis paradox reminds us that reasoning has limits. There are boundaries between logical transitions and logical contradictions. When those boundaries are crossed without justification, the logical foundation of an argument can collapse. Understanding the limits of reasoning and how to navigate metabasis with clarity and purpose is essential for effective argumentation and maintaining the integrity of one's conclusions. Observer's paradox. Imagine you are looking at a painting in an art gallery. Your perception of the colors, shapes, and overall composition depends entirely on the way light reflects off the canvas and enters your eyes. But what if I told you that by observing the painting, you are not merely interpreting it, but actively shaping its reality? The observer's paradox presents a fascinating dilemma in the realms of philosophy, epistemology, and quantum mechanics. The paradoxical effect that observation can have on the observed reality. In some cases, the act of observation doesn't just capture reality, it creates or modifies it. Take, for instance, the quantum observer effect, where particles do not have definite properties until they are observed. In a more philosophical sense, the observer's paradox challenges the nature of perception, suggesting that reality and truth may not be absolute, but could be influenced by the act of observing. How does our consciousness, or even the act of measurement, alter the world around us? Let's dive into the observer's paradox, a concept that forces us to question the nature of reality, perception, and the very act of observing itself. The observer's paradox is most closely associated with concepts in philosophy and quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, the paradox is often discussed in the context of the measurement problem. According to quantum theory, particles do not exist in a specific state until they are observed. Instead, they exist in a superposition of multiple potential states. The famous thought experiment, Schrödinger's cat, highlights this paradox. A cat in a box is both alive and dead until someone observes it, collapsing the superposition into a single state. This idea, which emerged in the early 20th century with pioneers like Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, posed a challenge to classical notions of reality, suggesting that the observer plays a critical role in determining the outcome of a quantum event. The observer's paradox also extends to philosophy of perception. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant and George Berkeley raised questions about how perception interacts with reality, suggesting that our observations of the world are not passive but actively shape the reality we experience. In Kant's philosophy, reality is seen as something filtered through our senses, implying that we do not have direct access to the world as it truly is. Similarly, Berkeley's idealism argued that the existence of objects depends on them being perceived. Thus, both philosophers set the stage for a modern understanding of the observer's paradox, where the observer and the observed cannot be entirely separated. The paradox has gained further prominence in contemporary science fiction, epistemology, and quantum physics, as discussions of consciousness and reality become increasingly complex. The observer's paradox is an intellectual conundrum that arises from the idea that the act of observation, whether in quantum mechanics, philosophy, or even in everyday life, can influence or alter the nature of reality itself. This paradox blurs the line between the observer and the observed, suggesting that reality is not a passive entity waiting to be discovered, but something that might depend on our perception and interaction with it. The paradox raises fundamental questions about knowledge, truth, and existence, forcing us to reconsider the nature of the world around us. The observer's paradox first gained significant attention in the realm of quantum mechanics, where it is often framed as the measurement problem. According to quantum theory, particles exist in a superposition of multiple states until they are observed. For instance, an electron might simultaneously exist in several possible positions, speeds, and directions. However, once we measure or observe the electron, its wave function collapses and the particle assumes a definite state. The act of measurement or observation determines the outcome. This phenomenon, famously illustrated by Schrödinger's cat, suggests that the observer plays an active role in determining the state of the system. The cat in the box is both alive and dead until someone opens the box to check. The paradox lies in the fact that the observer doesn't merely detect an already existing state, their observation creates the state. This challenges our classical understanding of reality, which assumes that objects and events exist independently of whether or not they are observed. The measurement problem presents the paradoxical idea that reality is not independent of the observer, but is instead influenced by the act of observation. The act of observing collapses the multiple possibilities into a single outcome, which leads to the question, does reality only truly exist when it is observed? In quantum mechanics, the wave function is a mathematical description of all the possible states a quantum system could occupy. Upon observation, the wave function collapses into one of these possible states. This leads to the question, what exactly constitutes an observation? Is it the simple act of measurement, or does it require conscious awareness? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that the consciousness of the observer is necessary for the wave function to collapse, raising further questions about the relationship between consciousness and reality. The Copenhagen interpretation, developed by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, posits that the observer's role in the collapse of the wave function is essential for defining the state of a quantum system. However, this interpretation does not specify exactly what constitutes an observer, leaving the role of consciousness in quantum theory open to interpretation. Some quantum theorists, such as Eugene Wigner, have proposed that consciousness itself is required to collapse the wave function, suggesting that our awareness of the universe plays a critical role in defining the universe. The observer's paradox in quantum mechanics raises the unsettling possibility that the universe, or at least certain aspects of it, may not have a definite state until it is perceived, and our consciousness may be key to determining this state. The observer's paradox is not confined to quantum physics, but also has deep roots in philosophy, particularly in the field of epistemology, the theory of knowledge. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant famously argued that we do not have access to the things in themselves, noumena, but only to the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us through our senses. In other words, we do not directly observe reality, but experience a filtered version of it, shaped by our sensory apparatus and cognitive processes. Kant's view implies that reality, as we know it, is not something objective and independent of our perception, but rather something that is actively constructed by our mind. This suggests that the observer is not merely a passive recipient of information, but is involved in shaping the way the world appears to them. According to this perspective, the act of observation doesn't just reveal the world, it creates a version of the world that aligns with our mental and sensory faculties. This philosophy echoes the observer's paradox, the idea that the act of observing is not a neutral process, but an active one, shaping our experience of reality. In Kantian terms, we cannot know reality as it truly is, only as it is presented to us through our perception. The observer's paradox can also be explored through the lens of George Berkeley's idealism. Berkeley famously argued that to be is to be perceived. According to Berkeley, objects do not exist independently of being perceived. Instead, their existence depends on being perceived by a mind. In other words, the very existence of objects is tied to the act of observation. For Berkeley, reality is entirely dependent on the mind, and objects only exist insofar as they are perceived. This extreme form of the observer's paradox suggests that the observer is not just shaping how they experience the world, but is in fact actively creating the world around them. While this view was controversial in Berkeley's time, it highlights how deeply observation and perception are intertwined with the nature of reality. The observer's paradox also touches on the subjectivity of experience. Every individual's perception of the world is shaped by their own sensory experiences, cultural background, and personal biases. This subjectivity means that no two observers experience the same reality in the same way, leading to the paradoxical situation where multiple realities can coexist, each shaped by the individual perspectives of the observers. Thus, observation is not just about revealing what is already there, but about creating a version of reality that is unique to each observer. The observer's paradox raises profound questions about truth and knowledge. If our observations shape the reality we experience, what does this say about the objective reality of the world around us? Are we simply constructing reality, or is there an objective world that exists independently of our perception? This question is central to many philosophical debates about epistemology, the study of knowledge. If reality is, in part, constructed by our observations, how can we know anything about the world beyond our own subjective experience? The paradox forces us to confront the limitations of our knowledge and the potential biases inherent in any observation. The observer's paradox also brings us to the intriguing question of the relationship between consciousness and reality. In quantum mechanics, the idea that the observer plays a role in determining the outcome of an experiment suggests that consciousness itself might be fundamental to creating reality. If this is true, then the mind and consciousness may not be passive observers of the world, but active participants in its creation. This idea has significant implications for philosophy and science, especially in areas such as quantum theory, neuroscience, and metaphysics. The observer's paradox highlights the complex interplay between observation, perception, and reality. Whether in quantum mechanics, philosophy of perception, or everyday life, the paradox forces us to reconsider the relationship between the observer and the observed. It challenges the traditional view that we are passive recipients of an external reality and suggests that our perception and observation may play a more active role in shaping the world we experience. The observer's paradox invites us to explore the limits of knowledge, the nature of reality, and the role of consciousness in defining the world around us. It underscores the idea that reality is not a static, objective entity, but something that is constantly influenced by the act of observing. Ship Paradox. Imagine a society where social behaviors and group dynamics are expected to follow a predictable pattern. Norms, rules, and social pressures typically shape the way individuals behave within a group. Yet, despite the expectation that people will conform to the social order, certain behaviors still occur in seemingly irrational or unexpected ways. This is the essence of the Ship Paradox, a phenomenon where social norms and expectations do not always produce the predicted social outcomes. What happens when individuals in a society deviate from the expected norms in ways that are difficult to explain through traditional models of social behavior? How can society's norms create unexpected consequences despite the belief that social conformity leads to predictable behavior? The Ship Paradox challenges us to rethink how societal norms and individual behavior interact, suggesting that even in a highly structured social environment, unexpected behaviors can emerge. Let's explore the Taiba paradox, where social behavior defies prediction and group dynamics do not always align with what we expect based on existing norms. The Taiba paradox is named after Harold Taiba, a sociologist whose work in the mid-20th century focused on social behavior, group dynamics and cultural norms. Taiba's research examined how social structures and group behaviors often deviate from the expectations set by traditional theories of sociology, particularly structural functionalism. During the 1940s and 1950s, structural functionalism dominated sociological thought, suggesting that social norms and structures were designed to produce order and stability within societies. According to this perspective, the behavior of individuals within a group could be predicted based on the social structures and norms in place. However, Taiba's research revealed that, in some cases, social behavior did not conform to these expectations, and unexpected outcomes arose despite the presence of established social norms. In his studies, Taiba observed that social behavior could not always be explained through simple cause and effect relationships between norms and behavioral outcomes. He noted that cultural norms and social expectations often interacted in complex ways, sometimes leading to counterintuitive or irrational outcomes. This observation became the basis for what is now known as the Taiba paradox. Taiba's work suggested that social norms could have unintended consequences that were not necessarily aligned with the overarching goals of the society. The paradox forces us to question the predictability of human behavior within social structures, suggesting that even well-established norms and rules can lead to unexpected and sometimes contradictory results. The Taiba paradox presents a compelling challenge to traditional sociological theories that view social norms and group behavior as predictable and controllable. Taiba's research suggests that social behavior does not always follow the expectations set by cultural norms, and in some cases, behaviors that emerge from the group may be in direct contrast to what the norms intended to achieve. This paradox can be broken down into several key components: the nature of social norms, the complexity of human behavior, and the unintended consequences of group dynamics. In most societies, social norms are established to maintain order and cohesion. These norms guide individuals' behavior and ensure that actions within the group align with shared values and goals. Laws, traditions, and social expectations are meant to direct how people interact, what is deemed acceptable behavior, and what is considered deviant or disruptive. From a structural functionalist perspective, the presence of these norms should ensure that behavior within a group is predictable, regulated, and conducive to the welfare of society as a whole. For instance, cultural norms surrounding family life, education, and workplace behavior are intended to keep societies functioning smoothly, fostering mutual respect, collaboration, and harmony. Under the assumption that social norms guide behavior, we might expect that individuals within a society will generally conform to these norms in a way that ensures consistency and order. The predictability of behavior is often central to how societies design laws and institutions. By establishing norms, societies believe they can control outcomes and create stable, predictable systems. However, the Taiba paradox challenges this notion. While norms may influence behavior, they do not always produce the results anticipated by sociological theories. Instead, human behavior is far more complex and can lead to outcomes that diverge from what social structures aim to achieve. Human behavior is not only shaped by external social forces, but also by internal psychological motivations, individual desires, and social experiences. People may act according to personal beliefs, values, and emotions that do not always align with the expectations set by the society or community. This complexity makes it difficult to predict individual actions based purely on social norms. In some cases, individuals may consciously or unconsciously disregard societal expectations due to a variety of personal motivations. For example, rebellion, discontent, or cultural differences may lead some individuals or groups to challenge established norms, even if it goes against what society considers to be beneficial or moral. The concept of deviance in sociology highlights the fact that not all behaviors conform to social norms. Deviance is the term used to describe actions that violate societal expectations, and it plays a critical role in understanding the Taiba paradox. While deviance is often viewed as negative or disruptive, it can also be creative and lead to social change. For example, movements for civil rights, gender equality, and LGBTQ+ rights all began as forms of deviance from the traditional norms of their time. In these cases, behavior that was initially seen as deviant eventually led to positive social transformation. Thus, even though social norms are intended to regulate behavior, deviant actions can disrupt the status quo and lead to unintended consequences, both positive and negative. The paradox lies in how these deviations from norms can propel society forward or create unintended challenges that cannot be easily controlled by existing societal structures. The behavior of individuals within a group does not always align with the intentions of the group as a whole. Group dynamics often lead to collective behaviors that are difficult to predict based on the actions of individual members. This complexity is at the heart of the Taiba paradox. Social norms and rules may try to shape individual behavior, but group behavior can often take on a life of its own, diverging from what was originally intended. For example, in a workplace or political setting, the collective behavior of a group may be driven by factors such as groupthink, peer pressure, and the desire for acceptance, rather than individual goals or motivations. These factors can lead to irrational decisions that are inconsistent with the intentions of the group's norms or objectives. The unintended consequences of group dynamics, such as decisions that ultimately harm the group or society, are a key aspect of the Taiba paradox. A powerful force in shaping behavior is the pressure to conform to the expectations of others. Social influence and compliance often compel individuals to act in ways that are consistent with the behavior of the group or social network they belong to. However, this pressure can sometimes lead to negative outcomes. For instance, in certain settings, individuals may act against their better judgment or personal values simply to fit in with the group, leading to unethical or harmful behaviors. The Taiba paradox explores the tension between individual agency and group conformity. Even though social norms are designed to regulate behavior and promote positive outcomes, they often lead to behaviors that are not easily anticipated and may result in harmful consequences that undermine the original intentions of the group. The Taiba paradox forces us to reconsider the notion that social norms alone can predict or control behavior. While norms are important in shaping general patterns of behavior, they do not guarantee that individuals will always conform to them. Social behavior is influenced by a variety of factors, including personal motivations, group dynamics, and cultural context, which makes it difficult to anticipate all possible outcomes. In light of the Taiba paradox, it becomes clear that social structures and norms must be viewed as just one piece of a much larger puzzle. To understand social behavior more fully, we need to account for the complexity of human interactions and the potential for unexpected deviations from the norm. The paradox also has implications for how societies approach policy and social change. If social norms cannot always produce the desired outcomes, it is crucial for policymakers to consider alternative methods of influence, including education, incentives, and behavioral interventions. Understanding that human behavior is not always predictable or rational can help in crafting policies that are more effective in addressing complex social issues. The Taiba paradox also suggests that deviance can have a positive role in social evolution. While deviating from social norms is often seen as disruptive or negative, many of society's greatest advancements, whether in civil rights, technology, or art, have emerged as a result of individuals or groups challenging established norms. Embracing the paradox can allow us to appreciate the constructive role of deviance and the value of nonconformity in driving progress. The Taiba paradox reminds us that social behavior is complex, multifaceted, and often unpredictable. While social norms are essential for maintaining order and promoting positive outcomes, they do not always produce the results we expect. Deviations from these norms can lead to both positive and negative consequences, making social behavior an ongoing dynamic of conflict, adaptation, and unexpected results. By embracing the Taiba paradox, we can gain a deeper understanding of how individuals and groups interact within societies, and how these interactions shape the fabric of human existence. Voting paradox. Imagine you are in a room with a group of people, all tasked with making a collective decision, such as choosing a leader or voting on a law. The decision is crucial to the group's future. Yet when it comes time to vote, something strange happens. Despite the best efforts to reach a fair and rational decision, the outcome is counterintuitive, and no one is satisfied. This is the essence of the voting paradox, where collective decisions, made through voting, do not always align with the individual preferences of the participants. It shows how rational individual choices can lead to irrational collective outcomes. A decision that seems fair and democratic may actually lead to results that do not represent the true will of the people. From voting systems to election outcomes, this paradox challenges the assumptions we have about rationality, fairness, and majority rule. Let's dive into the voting paradox and uncover why democratic decision-making can sometimes lead to unexpected and undesirable results. The voting paradox was first articulated by the French mathematician and philosopher Condorcet in the 18th century. Condorcet's jury theorem introduced the idea that voting systems could lead to paradoxical outcomes when individual preferences are aggregated to make collective decisions. The paradox arises when rational choices made by individuals do not necessarily result in a rational collective choice. The paradox was formalized further in the 20th century through the work of Kenneth Arrow, who developed Arrow's impossibility theorem in his book Social Choice and Individual Values, 1951. Arrow's theorem proved that no voting system can perfectly translate individual preferences into a collective decision that is fair and consistent under a set of seemingly reasonable conditions. In other words, when voting systems aggregate individual preferences to make a collective choice, they often produce results that fail to represent the true will of the people. The voting paradox continues to be a topic of discussion in political science, economics, and philosophy, especially when considering the limitations of democratic processes. It highlights the complexities of majority rule and raises important questions about the fairness and efficiency of voting systems in modern democracies. The voting paradox exposes the deep complexities and potential flaws in democratic decision-making. Despite its foundational role in modern societies, voting can lead to irrational outcomes that fail to reflect the true preferences of the electorate. This paradox illustrates how rational individual choices can aggregate into irrational collective decisions. Let's break down the paradox and examine its implications for elections, democratic processes, and social choice theory. The voting paradox occurs when individual preferences are aggregated into a collective decision, but the outcome of that aggregation doesn't reflect the preferences of the majority. More formally, it refers to situations where rational individual choices, based on personal preferences, lead to counterintuitive, irrational, or undesirable collective outcomes. One of the most well-known examples of the voting paradox is Condorcet's paradox. Condorcet's paradox occurs when three or more choices are on the table and the voters are asked to rank them. In such cases, it is possible for there to be no clear winner according to majority rule. This happens when preferences are cyclical. For example, A is preferred to B is preferred to C, but C is preferred to A. In this case, there is no transitive preference across the candidates, and no majority rule can identify a clear winner. Let's look at a simplified scenario. Voter 1 prefers A greater than B greater than C. Voter 2 prefers B greater than C greater than A. Voter 3 prefers C greater than A greater than B. If we count the majority preferences between pairs, we get A versus B. Voter 1 prefers A over B. Voter 2 prefers B over A. Therefore, B wins. B versus C. Voter 1 prefers B over C, Voter 2 prefers B over C, and Voter 3 prefers C over B. Therefore, B wins. C beats A. Voter 1 prefers A over C, Voter 2 prefers C over A, and Voter 3 prefers C over A. Therefore, C wins. Thus, B beats A, B beats C, and C beats A, creating a cycle where no single option is preferred over all the others by a majority. This is a clear example of Condorcet's paradox. Despite individual preferences being clear, there is no consistent outcome based on majority rule. In voting systems, majority rule is often used to aggregate preferences. However, majority rule can lead to intransitive preferences, where A greater than B, B greater than C, but C greater than A, resulting in an irrational collective decision. This paradox highlights a fundamental flaw in majority-based voting systems, as they do not always lead to consistent and fair outcomes. One of the most famous contributions to the study of the voting paradox is Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem, which states that no voting system can satisfy all of the following desirable conditions simultaneously. Unanimity. If every individual prefers one option to another, the group's decision should reflect that preference. Non-dictatorship. The group's decision should not simply reflect the preference of a single individual. Independence of irrelevant alternatives. The choice between two options should not be influenced by the presence of a third, irrelevant option. Pareto efficiency. If everyone prefers one option to another, the group should prefer that option as well. Arrow's theorem shows that it is impossible to design a voting system that is fair, consistent, and representative in all cases. This creates a voting paradox because even though majority rule seems like the most democratic way to make decisions, it can often lead to irrational collective outcomes that fail to represent the true preferences of the population. The voting paradox has profound implications for democracy and collective decision-making. It forces us to question whether majority rule is the best system for aggregating preferences in situations of interdependence and group decision-making. The voting paradox illustrates that majority rule may not always reflect the true will of the people. When preferences are cyclical or intransitive, the majority's choice may not result in the most favored outcome for society. This highlights the potential inefficiencies and flaws in democratic systems that rely solely on majority voting. The paradox raises questions about the fairness of democratic decisions. If the collective outcome does not reflect the preferences of the majority of individuals, then how can we consider the outcome fair or legitimate? The paradox challenges us to think about alternative decision-making processes, such as consensus-based models or ranked choice voting, which may better account for the diversity of preferences and reduce the inefficiencies inherent in majority rule. The voting paradox extends beyond theoretical models to real-world situations. Here are some key examples where the paradox plays a role. In elections, the voting paradox often arises when multiple candidates are involved. Plurality voting, the system where the candidate with the most votes wins, can lead to outcomes where a candidate who does not have broad support across the electorate wins simply because the votes are split among multiple candidates. This can result in a situation where the winning candidate is not the most preferred candidate overall. In corporate governance, shareholder votes can lead to paradoxical outcomes when decisions are made through majority rule but do not necessarily reflect the true desires of the stakeholders. This can occur in situations where shareholders are forced to make decisions that affect the company's direction, but the voting system does not fully represent the interests of the minority shareholders or stakeholders. The voting paradox is also relevant in international relations, especially when decisions are made in multilateral forums like the United Nations or World Trade Organization. In these organizations, the voting system often leads to compromise solutions that do not fully satisfy any one nation's interests. The paradox arises when the majority decision does not align with the true interests of the collective group, or when the preferences of smaller nations are overlooked in favor of the larger powers. The voting paradox shows that majority rule and traditional voting systems can be flawed and inefficient. Several alternative systems have been proposed to address the paradox and create more fair and representative decision-making processes. Ranked choice voting, also known as instant runoff voting, allows voters to rank candidates in order of preference. If no candidate wins a majority, the candidate with the least votes is eliminated and votes are redistributed according to the voters' second choices, until a majority winner is found. RCV helps to avoid situations where a less popular candidate wins due to vote splitting. The Condorcet method seeks to find the candidate who would win in a head-to-head competition with every other candidate. This method tries to resolve the issue of cyclical preferences by identifying the Condorcet winner, the candidate who would defeat all others in pairwise voting. Deliberative democracy focuses on group discussions and reasoned deliberation to achieve a consensus-based decision, rather than relying solely on majority rule. This approach seeks to balance individual preferences with the collective good by fostering dialogue and compromise among all participants. Moving rows paradox. Imagine a crowded theatre where the rows of seats are arranged in a neat, orderly fashion. However, something strange happens. Every time someone moves forward, everyone in the row ahead of them shifts by one seat. You could have endless rows of people, and no matter how far they move, the next person will always end up ahead of you, making it feel like you are stuck in an infinite loop. This is the essence of the moving rows paradox, a fascinating thought experiment that explores how infinite processes can create a situation where even simple actions seem to lead to paradoxes of movement and space. The paradox questions the concept of infinity, showing how seemingly simple changes in order can lead to complex, counterintuitive outcomes when applied to infinite systems. How can infinite movement result in something that appears simultaneously orderly and chaotic? Let's explore the moving rows paradox and uncover the surprising implications it has for our understanding of space, infinity, and order. The moving rose paradox is a modern thought experiment that ties into the broader field of infinity paradoxes, particularly those related to infinite sets and the manipulation of space. While not as well known as paradoxes like Zeno's paradoxes or the Hilbert Hotel, it builds on similar themes regarding the concept of infinity and the counterintuitive results that arise when infinite processes are involved. The paradox is typically framed using a metaphor of rows of people in a theatre or seats on a bus, where everyone in the row ahead moves forward by one seat at regular intervals. The paradox challenges our understanding of infinite movement, highlighting how simple rules can create complex or even seemingly contradictory situations when applied to infinite systems. Though it has not been formally discussed by famous philosophers or mathematicians, it shares many of the key features of infinity paradoxes, such as recursive movements, infinite regress, and the resolution of space. The paradox often leads to questions about how infinity interacts with time, space, and order, much like Zeno's paradoxes, which deal with the conflict between infinite divisions and finite distances. Philosophers and mathematicians have used the moving rose paradox to provoke deeper thought about the nature of infinity and the paradoxical results that arise when it's applied to systems that should appear straightforward in finite terms. And the paradox continues to be a powerful tool for understanding the limits of spatial organization, order, and infinite processes. The moving rose paradox highlights a fascinating aspect of infinity and spatial arrangements that defy conventional logic. It draws upon the concept of infinite processes and how sequential movements can lead to seemingly paradoxical outcomes. While simple in premise, the paradox reveals deep insights about order, infinity, and space. Let's break down the paradox and examine its implications in detail. To understand the moving rose paradox, let's start with a simple setup involving infinite rows of seats in a theatre. Suppose there are infinitely many rows, and in each row an infinite number of seats. The seats are occupied by people, and the following rule is in place. Every time someone moves forward, everyone in the row ahead of them moves forward by one seat. In other words, for every individual action, say a person in row 5 moving forward by one seat, everyone ahead of them in rows 1-4 must also move forward by one seat. Let's say we start by moving the first person in the first row forward by one seat. This seems like a simple change, a single move forward in a well-ordered structure. But as they move forward, the rest of the people in the rows ahead of them must also shift by one seat. This action creates a domino effect of movement that seems to reorder the entire system. At first, everything seems fine, but as the process repeats and becomes recursive, strange things begin to happen. Since there are infinitely many rows, this seemingly simple movement of one person eventually affects the entire system in ways that are not immediately obvious. Each subsequent movement seems to perpetuate an infinite cycle where people keep shifting forward, making it appear like no one ever reaches their final destination. An odd situation for something that seemed so well ordered. As more people shift forward, the paradox becomes clear. Even though the system is set up to be ordered, the result is a never-ending series of movements that doesn't lead to a clear conclusion. The infinite nature of the rows creates an infinite regress, where the act of moving forward creates more shifting, and this shifting perpetuates the paradox, making it seem like no one ever truly gets anywhere. One of the key features of the moving rows paradox is the idea of infinite movement and how it creates a logical deadlock. At first, the system seems simple. Each person just moves forward one seat. But when applied to an infinite system, the rules become counterintuitive. The paradox is rooted in the infinite division of space. In a finite scenario, a movement as simple as moving forward one seat is straightforward, but when applied to infinite rows, it becomes infinitely recursive. This infinite division of space leads to the question, how can infinite movements happen in a finite time frame? This mirrors similar paradoxes, like Zeno's paradoxes, where infinite divisions of a finite distance create contradictions. In the case of the moving rows paradox, the act of moving forward can never truly finish because infinite actions cannot be completed in a finite amount of time. The infinite regress created by moving forward means that no individual action can ever fully resolve the paradox. In the paradox, no individual reaches their destination despite the infinite actions. Even though everyone is moving forward, no one seems to get closer to the end because the motion itself is perpetual. The finality of each action becomes a non-terminating loop, which can be seen as an impossibility. This suggests that, in infinite systems, actions that should appear finite and deterministic lead to never-ending processes. This highlights a broader issue with infinite processes. They challenge our intuition about movement, progress, and order. In real-world situations, we expect actions to produce tangible results, but in an infinite system, no result ever seems to be final. The moving rose paradox brings to light the limits of our understanding of infinity and how it interacts with space. Infinite regress suggests that some systems may never come to a final state, which challenges the assumption that all actions will eventually result in completion. In mathematics, this paradox is closely related to infinite sets and recursive processes. Just as the Hilbert Hotel paradox illustrates the paradoxical nature of infinity in terms of space, where infinite rooms can always accommodate more guests, the moving rose paradox explores how infinite processes create a situation where progress is perpetually deferred. A critical element of the paradox is the role of time in an infinite system. Infinite processes create situations where time appears to be moving forward, but no final conclusion is reached. The infinite duration of movement suggests that time, when applied to an infinite system, becomes a paradoxical entity itself. Time can appear to pass, but since each individual move perpetuates the cycle, no true end state is achieved. This leads to questions about how infinity interacts with time in real-world systems. The moving rose paradox also illustrates the limitations of linear thinking in decision-making and progress. In situations where progress is seen as sequential, like a series of movements, infinite recursion shows how the linear view of progress can fail in more complex systems. The paradox suggests that non-lunar thinking and non-terminating systems may require a new understanding of how we conceive of success and outcomes. The moving rose paradox extends beyond thought experiments and can be seen as a metaphor for several real-world phenomena. The paradox can be applied to bureaucratic systems where procedures or paperwork seem to multiply, creating an endless loop of processes. In many organizations, progress is hindered by endless steps that do not lead to a definitive outcome. This is akin to the paradox, where actions are taken, but the final goal never seems to be reached. The paradox can also be applied to discussions of economic growth. In the context of infinite growth in a world with finite resources, economic systems may seem to continually push forward, but there is no true end to the growth process. The paradox illustrates how unlimited expansion may face contradictions and inefficiencies in the long run. On an individual level, the paradox can represent personal growth, where individuals set goals and make incremental progress. Yet, because each step leads to a new set of tasks, the final state of success or completion can feel elusive, as personal growth seems to be a never-ending process. Paradox of the grain of millet paradox. Imagine you have a small pile of millet grains. One by one, you begin adding more grains to the pile, and each time you add another, it still looks like a small pile. No noticeable change. But then, at some point, you add another grain, and suddenly the pile is big enough to be considered a heap. This is the essence of the paradox of the grain of millet. At what point does a small pile of grains transform into a heap? If you keep adding grains one at a time, where does the transformation happen? This paradox challenges our understanding of thresholds and gradual change. It illustrates how small incremental changes can eventually lead to a conceptual leap, even though each individual change seems insignificant. The paradox forces us to consider how we define things like heaps, piles, and boundaries when the changes are so gradual that no single step seems to make a difference. Let's explore the paradox of the grain of millet, where accumulation leads to a point of conceptual transformation, raising questions about categories, boundaries, and how we understand change. The paradox of the grain of millet is closely related to Sorites paradoxes, also known as the paradox of the heap. The term Sorites is derived from the Greek word for heap, and the paradox dates back to ancient Greek philosophy, specifically Eubulides of Miletus, 4th century BCE. Eubulides used this paradox to illustrate the problem of defining when a gradual accumulation of small changes results in a significant conceptual transformation. The paradox of the grain of millet, or similar small units, are needed to form a heap. If you add a grain, you have a slightly larger pile, but no one would call it a heap. Gradually adding more grains doesn't seem to change the nature of the pile until a certain threshold is reached, but pinpointing when that threshold occurs is difficult. The Sorites paradox has been a subject of debate in philosophy and logic for centuries, often used to explore issues related to vagueness, continuity, and conceptual boundaries. The paradox of the grain of millet serves as a concrete example of how we grapple with these gradual changes and thresholds, especially when our language and categories fail to account for small, incremental shifts. It also raises important questions about borderline cases, where we struggle to categorize things that seem to fall into a grey area. The paradox of the grain of millet is a compelling example of how gradual changes can eventually result in a conceptual leap that challenges our understanding of boundaries and categories. It forces us to question how we define things like a heap or a pile, and explore how the process of accumulation leads to significant changes that don't seem to occur with any single step. Let's break down the paradox, its philosophical implications, and how it sheds light on the nature of gradual change and thresholds. The paradox of the grain of millet involves a pile of millet grains or any other small unit. The paradox is set up with the following scenario. You begin with a small pile of grains. Gradually, you add one grain at a time. At each step, the pile grows slightly larger, but it is still not perceived as a heap. Eventually, after adding enough grains, the pile reaches a point where it is unquestionably a heap. But the paradox asks, how many grains does it take for the pile to transform from not a heap into a heap? Each individual grain added doesn't seem to make a significant difference. If a pile of 999 grains isn't a heap, adding a single grain seems like it shouldn't suddenly turn the pile into a heap, but at some point it does. The paradox highlights the difficulty of pinpointing thresholds when changes occur gradually. The central issue in the paradox of the grain of millet is the gradual nature of the change. The paradox forces us to reconsider the way we think about continuity and discreteness. In many real-world situations, changes happen gradually, and yet we categorize things in discrete terms. For example, a pile of anything can gradually turn into a heap or a mountain depending on the context, but we struggle to define exactly when the transformation happens. This gradual process can be seen as a continuum, a process where the change is so subtle that we can't easily define the precise point at which one thing becomes another. This mirrors issues we often encounter in language and classification. One of the most important philosophical aspects of the paradox of the grain of millet is its relation to vagueness. Vagueness arises when there is no clear-cut boundary between categories, like what counts as a heap versus what doesn't. The paradox of the grain of millet is a specific instance of the broader Sorites paradox. The Sorite paradox asks how many grains of millet, or sand, or anything else are needed to form a heap. If we add one grain at a time, we encounter a problem of vagueness. At what point does a small pile become a heap? It's difficult to pinpoint a clear boundary where the transition happens, because the process is gradual. Philosophers have long debated how to handle these borderline cases, situations where the classification of something is unclear or ambiguous. This vagueness is not limited to physical objects, but extends to conceptual categories like baldness, richness, or tallness. For example, if someone has just a few hairs on their head, are they bald or not? The vagueness of such categories is part of the paradox of the grain of millet, where the issue is not about the exact quantity of grains, but about the conceptual shift from one category to another. The paradox raises the question of whether we can ever have precise categories for things that change gradually. How do we define when something like a heap or a pile exists? Or when something becomes something else? The moving threshold that defines the boundary is elusive, and the paradox suggests that our use of categories in everyday life might be less definite than we would like to believe. The paradox of the grain of millet has profound implications for how we think about boundaries, categories, and conceptual change. It pushes us to reconsider our assumptions about the way we classify things and how we understand the transition from one category to another. One of the philosophical questions raised by the paradox is how we understand continuity. Gradual changes over time often do not fit neatly into discrete categories. While we might think of a heap as a specific category, the change from a small pile to a heap occurs gradually, with no single step clearly defining the transition. The paradox suggests that our thinking about categories may need to account for continuous processes rather than fixed boundaries. The paradox also forces us to reconsider how we use language to describe reality. When we talk about heaps, we may be thinking about an abstract category, but in reality the world consists of continuous phenomena that don't always fit into clear-cut categories. Our reliance on conceptual distinctions, such as heap, vs pile, may not accurately reflect the fluid nature of the world around us. In response to the Sorites paradox, philosophers have explored solutions involving fuzzy logic, a system where concepts are not binary but exist in degrees. In fuzzy logic, categories like heap or pile could be viewed as existing on a spectrum, where the degree to which something is a heap depends on how many grains are in the pile. Instead of a sharp line dividing piles from heaps, we might recognize that there are gradual shifts and that fuzzy categories can better reflect how we experience the world. The paradox of the grain of Millet is not just a thought experiment, it has real-world applications in areas such as decision-making, policy and social behavior. In economics, gradual accumulation can lead to significant change over time, even when no single event seems large enough to make a difference. For example, small changes in a person's income over time might not significantly affect their lifestyle at first, but over many years, these small changes can result in dramatic shifts in wealth or quality of life. This mirrors the gradual shift in the paradox, where incremental changes eventually lead to major transitions. In the realm of social policy, the paradox applies to issues like poverty or climate change. Small changes in policy or behavior may not seem to have an immediate impact, but over time they can lead to major social shifts. Addressing poverty, for example, involves many small actions. Increasing the minimum wage, providing education, healthcare and social services that add up to larger changes in the long run. The paradox also applies to the environment. Global warming and environmental degradation occur as a result of incremental changes over time. Each small act of pollution or resource depletion seems inconsequential in isolation, but collectively they have the power to alter the environmental landscape dramatically. The paradox of the grain of millet challenges us to reconsider how we categorize the world and how we deal with gradual change. To resolve this paradox, we may need to embrace fuzzy logic, continuity, and the understanding that concepts are not always discrete but are often gradual. By adopting fuzzy logic, we can better understand how gradual accumulation leads to conceptual shifts. Instead of expecting a sharp, clear line between categories, we can recognize that some transitions are smooth and continuous, with no single moment defining the shift. The paradox suggests that boundaries in our thinking are less fixed than we might believe. In real life, many categories are fluid and subject to gradual change. Instead of looking for rigid definitions, we can acknowledge the gradual process of categorization and how small shifts can lead to large-scale transformations. Maxwell's demon paradox. Imagine a tiny, invisible demon sitting between two chambers of gas. One chamber is hot and the other is cold. The demon, with incredible precision, can sort particles by their speed, allowing only fast particles to pass from the hot side to the cold side, and only slow particles from the cold side to the hot side. As a result, the demon appears to decrease the system's overall entropy, seemingly creating a violation of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy should always increase in an isolated system. This is the essence of the Maxwell's demon paradox, a thought experiment introduced by James Clerk Maxwell in 1867. The paradox questions whether it's possible to violate the second law of thermodynamics using information and control over individual particles. If this demon can seemingly lower the entropy of a system by sorting particles based on their energy, it appears to defy the idea that entropy always increases. How can information processing in the form of the demon's actions possibly influence the thermodynamics of a system? Let's explore Maxwell's demon paradox, where entropy, information, and the second law of thermodynamics collide in a thought-provoking puzzle about the nature of energy, control, and information. The Maxwell's demon paradox was proposed by the Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell in 1867 to illustrate an apparent contradiction in thermodynamics. Maxwell's thought experiment was designed to highlight the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the entropy of an isolated system, and the second law implies that natural processes move from states of lower entropy to states of higher entropy. Maxwell introduced the demon as a hypothetical being capable of observing and controlling individual gas molecules. The demon can selectively open a trapdoor between two chambers filled with gas, allowing only fast molecules to pass from the hot chamber to the cold chamber and only slow molecules to pass from the cold chamber to the hot chamber. By doing so, the demon effectively separates high-energy particles from low-energy ones, seemingly reducing the entropy of the system and creating a temperature difference without any external work. The paradox challenged the second law of thermodynamics, suggesting that a system could be made to decrease its entropy if the demon could process information and manipulate particles accordingly. However, this apparent violation of the second law prompted significant debate, ultimately leading to the recognition that the paradox could be resolved by considering the role of information processing and the energy cost of the demon's actions. Maxwell's demon was later used to illustrate the relationship between information theory and thermodynamics, particularly in discussions about the role of information in the physical world and its connection to the second law of thermodynamics. The Maxwell's demon paradox forces us to question the relationship between entropy, information, and the second law of thermodynamics. In the thought experiment, Maxwell's demon is able to selectively manipulate particles based on their energy, seemingly violating the second law by reducing the overall entropy of the system. The paradox brings up several important issues in the foundations of thermodynamics: the nature of information, and the limits of control in physical systems. 1. The second law of thermodynamics and entropy. A. The second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics states that in an isolated system, the total entropy of the system will tend to increase over time. Entropy is a measure of the degree of disorder in a system, and the law suggests that natural processes always move toward a state of greater disorder or randomness. For example, when two different gases are allowed to mix, the system's entropy increases as the particles become more randomly distributed. The second law is considered one of the fundamental laws of nature, governing the behavior of energy and matter in closed systems. It is what makes irreversible processes such as heat transfer of gases and particles fundamentally unidirectional. B. The concept of entropy. In thermodynamic terms, entropy is a measure of the number of possible microstates, configurations of the system, consistent with the macroscopic variables like temperature, pressure, and volume. As systems evolve toward thermodynamic equilibrium, they tend to occupy states with the highest number of accessible microstates, which correspond to higher entropy. This explains why systems tend to dissipate energy and why processes like mixing or heat transfer naturally increase the disorder of the system. C. The paradox. Can entropy decrease? The Maxwell's demon paradox arises when we imagine a system of gas particles inside two chambers. The demon, by selectively controlling the movement of particles based on their speed, appears to create a scenario where the system's entropy decreases as the high-energy particles are separated from the low-energy ones. In effect, the demon is sorting particles into two distinct groups with different energies, which seems to reduce the disorder of the system. At first glance, this seems to violate the second law of thermodynamics, as we would expect the system to naturally evolve toward a state of maximum entropy. If the demon can continually decrease the entropy of the system, then it seems possible to create a perpetual decrease in entropy, which contradicts the natural tendency for entropy to increase in isolated systems. 2. The role of the demon, information and control. A. The information processing role of the demon, the key to resolving the Maxwell's demon paradox, lies in recognizing the role of information in the process. Maxwell's demon, despite being a hypothetical figure, is often seen as a metaphor for information processing in physical systems. The demon is able to reduce the system's entropy not by doing mechanical work, but by processing information about the speed of individual particles. The demon must observe the particles in the system, decide which particles are fast or slow, and then control the opening and closing of the trapdoor accordingly. This act of information gathering, decision-making, and control is crucial to the demon's ability to influence the system's entropy. B. The cost of information processing. The crucial insight is that the act of information processing itself requires energy. Landauer's principle, formulated by Rolf Landauer in 1961, states that erasing information from a system always requires energy. In the case of Maxwell's demon, The act of measuring the velocity of each particle and then making decisions about whether to allow it through the trapdoor involves information processing, which is not free. Even if the daemon seems to decrease the entropy of the system, the energy required for the daemon's information processing leads to a corresponding increase in entropy elsewhere. Essentially, while the daemon may be able to reduce the entropy of the gas, the process of measuring and deciding which particles to allow through the trapdoor introduces a new source of entropy elsewhere in the system, restoring the overall increase in entropy predicted by the second law of thermodynamics. C. Reversing information processing and entropy. The resolution of the paradox, therefore, depends on the information content of the daemon's actions. The daemon cannot act without consuming energy and generating entropy in the process. The overall entropy of the universe, including the daemon's information processing apparatus, still increases, preserving the second law of thermodynamics. Thus, while the daemon appears to perform a seemingly paradoxical act of reducing entropy in one system, the overall entropy increase is accounted for when considering the energy cost of the information processing actions. The Maxwell's daemon paradox helped to highlight that entropy is not only about the distribution of energy, but also about the state of knowledge in the system. The second law of thermodynamics can be seen as a statement about information, suggesting that disorder in the system corresponds to a lack of knowledge about its microscopic states. By processing information, the daemon can decrease this disorder, but at the cost of increasing entropy elsewhere. This realization bridged the gap between thermodynamics and information theory, paving the way for modern fields like quantum computing and computational thermodynamics. 4. Implications of the paradox. A. Reaffirming the second law of thermodynamics. The Maxwell's daemon paradox does not actually violate the second law of thermodynamics, but rather highlights the importance of considering information processing as part of the system's total energy budget. The paradox shows that the second law applies not just to the physical system itself, but to the entire process of information acquisition and manipulation. B. The relationship between thermodynamics and information theory. The resolution of Maxwell's daemon also led to a deeper understanding of how thermodynamics and information theory are connected. In essence, information is a form of energy, and any attempt to manipulate a system by processing information must account for the energy costs involved. This idea has implications for fields as diverse as quantum computing, biophysics, and information technology. C. The nature of control in physical systems. Maxwell's daemon also raises questions about the nature of control in physical systems. Can the manipulation of information allow us to control entropy directly, or are there limits to how much we can reduce disorder without incurring costs elsewhere? The paradox pushes us to think about the limits of control and optimization in both physical and computational systems. Hormesis paradox. In the vast diversity of life on Earth, one might assume that competition between species, especially within the same ecological niche, would lead to the survival of the fittest. Yet, in certain circumstances, species with similar ecological roles thrive together, rather than outcompeting each other. This is the essence of Gray's paradox, a mystery in evolutionary biology and ecology that challenges the idea that similar species should compete for resources in such a way that one drives the other to extinction. Instead, in many cases, closely related species can coexist and even complement each other within the same environment. How can species with similar traits avoid competitive exclusion, a concept central to evolutionary theory? This paradox presents a puzzle. Why do species that appear to be competitors thrive together in the same habitat, often occupying similar ecological niches? The paradox forces us to reconsider how competition and coexistence work in the natural world, suggesting that there may be other forces at play, like niche differentiation or evolutionary cooperation, that allow similar species to survive side by side. Let's dive into Gray's paradox, where evolutionary theory, species competition, and ecological dynamics collide in a surprising mystery about the survival of biodiversity. Gray's paradox was first introduced by the British ecologist H. Gray in the early 20th century as a way of explaining an intriguing observation in the field of evolutionary ecology. Closely related species that occupy similar ecological niches often coexist in the same environment, contrary to the expectations of competitive exclusion theory. Competitive exclusion theory, also known as the competitive exclusion principle, suggests that two species competing for the same limited resources cannot coexist indefinitely. One species is expected to outcompete the other, leading to the extinction of the less fit species or its migration to a different ecological niche. However, Gray observed that in many cases closely related species in similar ecological roles managed to coexist, leading to the paradox that such species did not compete in the way classical theory would predict. This observation raised important questions about the complexity of species interactions and ecological balance, suggesting that factors like niche differentiation, cooperation, or evolutionary strategies might allow species to coexist despite apparent competition. Since then, Gray's paradox has been an area of exploration in evolutionary ecology, prompting further studies into how species diversity is maintained in biodiverse ecosystems and how seemingly competitive species can evolve mechanisms of coexistence. The paradox challenges the simplistic models of species competition and suggests that the dynamics of evolutionary processes are more nuanced and complex than once thought. Gray's paradox presents a fascinating challenge to conventional evolutionary theories, particularly the competitive exclusion principle. The paradox highlights the surprising ability of species with similar ecological roles to coexist in the same environment without one species driving the other to extinction. The apparent contradiction between competition and coexistence raises questions about how species interact with each other and how biodiversity is maintained in ecosystems. 1. The competitive exclusion principle and its assumptions. A. The competitive exclusion principle. The competitive exclusion principle, introduced by Gauss in the 1990s and 1930s, states that two species competing for the same limited resources cannot coexist indefinitely. One species will always be better adapted to the environment and will eventually outcompete the other, leading to the extinction or migration of the less fit species. This principle has been a foundational concept in ecology and evolutionary biology, shaping our understanding of how species interact in the wild. According to this principle, when two species occupy the same niche, the specific set of resources, habitats, and environmental conditions they use, they should be in direct competition with each other. Over time, one species is expected to become more efficient in using the resources, leading to the elimination of the other. This would result in the dominance of the superior species in the ecosystem. B. Assumptions behind the principle. The competitive exclusion principle is built on several assumptions. First, it assumes that species have identical ecological requirements, meaning they rely on the same resources in the same way. Second, it assumes that there is no environmental variation that allows for niche differentiation. Third, it assumes that the competition between species is direct and that the evolutionary strategies of each species are focused on maximizing their own resource acquisition. These assumptions form the basis of classical models of species competition, but Gray's paradox challenges the simplicity of these models by suggesting that closely related species can thrive in the same ecological roles without necessarily outcompeting each other. 2. The observations of Gray's paradox. A. The existence of similar species. Gray's paradox highlights the observation that closely related species that appear to have similar ecological niches can sometimes coexist in the same environment. For example, many species of finches or cichlid fish in diverse ecosystems exhibit overlapping diets, habitats, and behavior. Despite sharing similar ecological roles, they are able to coexist in the same environment without one species driving the other to extinction. This is paradoxical because according to the competitive exclusion principle, species in similar niches should inevitably face competition for the same resources, which would result in the elimination of one species. However, in reality, these species often coexist and even exhibit complex interdependencies that help maintain biodiversity. B. Niche differentiation. One possible explanation for the coexistence of similar species is niche differentiation, the idea that species within the same ecological niche can evolve to exploit different aspects of the environment. This allows them to coexist by reducing direct competition. For example, species might specialize in different foraging techniques, feeding times, or habitat preferences, even if they overlap in the general type of resources they use. Niche differentiation could be a mechanism by which species reduce the intensity of competition and increase their chances of survival, For example, in a tropical rainforest, various bird species might feed on the same fruits, but at different times of day, reducing competition and allowing for the coexistence of multiple species in the same habitat. 3. Evolutionary strategies and the role of adaptation. Evolutionary mechanisms for coexistence. One of the key components of Gray's paradox is the role of evolutionary mechanisms that enable species to coexist despite sharing similar ecological niches. These mechanisms include character displacement, where species evolve to exploit different resources or occupy slightly different niches to reduce competition. Another mechanism is resource partitioning, where species divide resources among themselves in a way that minimizes direct competition. This can occur through temporal partitioning, e.g. different feeding times, spatial partitioning, e.g. different microhabitats, or dietary partitioning, e.g. feeding on different parts of a plant or animal. These strategies allow species to coexist in a way that contradicts the predictions of the competitive exclusion principle. Evolution can lead species to evolve differently, even if they occupy similar niches, reducing competition and fostering biodiversity. In some cases, species may evolve mechanisms of cooperation rather than competition. This can involve mutualistic relationships, where species benefit from each other's presence. For example, certain species of birds and herbivores might rely on each other for protection from predators, while simultaneously sharing resources such as feeding grounds. Evolutionary cooperation can also occur within species, leading to more cohesive communities that reduce the intensity of competition. Cooperation may be a key factor in allowing closely related species to thrive together in shared environments. 4. The role of environmental factors. Environmental heterogeneity. One explanation for the coexistence of similar species is the idea that environmental heterogeneity, the variability of habitats within an ecosystem, provides opportunities for species to exploit different microhabitats and reduce competition. For example, in a forest ecosystem, different species of trees, shrubs, and herbivores might occupy different niches within the same area by utilizing different parts of the environment. Environmental heterogeneity increases species diversity and allows for the coexistence of species that might otherwise compete for the same resources in a more uniform environment. This concept has been key in understanding how biodiversity is maintained across ecosystems and why seemingly similar species can persist in close proximity. Dispersal and evolutionary time. Another important factor is dispersal, the ability of species to migrate and establish populations in different habitats. Over time, dispersal events and geographic isolation can lead to the evolution of new species that adapt to different niches within the same region. This process of speciation can reduce direct competition between species and allow them to coexist. Additionally, evolutionary time plays a crucial role in the development of species interactions. Species that have coexisted for a long period of time may have evolved symbiotic relationships or mutualistic behaviors that allow them to share resources without outcompeting each other. 5. Implications of Gray's paradox for evolutionary theory. Rethinking competitive exclusion. Gray's paradox forces us to reconsider the assumptions of the competitive exclusion principle. While the principle is valuable in explaining many ecological interactions, it may not always apply when species develop complex, cooperative, or niche differentiated strategies. The paradox suggests that evolutionary strategies such as resource partitioning, character displacement, and mutualism are more important than previously thought in enabling species to coexist. Ecological balance and evolution. Gray's paradox also underscores the importance of ecological balance in maintaining biodiversity. It suggests that species interactions are often more complex than simple competition for resources and can involve intricate strategies that promote cooperation, niche differentiation, and evolutionary adaptation. The implications for conservation. Understanding how closely related species can coexist is crucial for conservation efforts, especially as human activities continue to alter ecosystems. The coexistence mechanisms highlighted by Gray's paradox can inform how we approach the conservation of species in increasingly crowded and changing habitats. By recognizing the importance of niche differentiation and evolutionary strategies, we can better protect biodiversity and help species survive in the face of environmental changes. Paradox of the pesticides. In a world increasingly dependent on agriculture, pesticides are seen as essential tools for protecting crops from pests, ensuring larger yields, and maintaining food security. But what happens when we use these chemicals to control pests? The expected result is that pest populations will decline and crops will thrive. However, a paradox emerges. After prolonged pesticide use, pest populations often grow stronger and more resistant to the chemicals that were initially designed to eliminate them. This is the paradox of the pesticide, a phenomenon where the very tools we use to control pest populations eventually lead to greater resistance, creating a never-ending cycle of increased pesticide use and worsening pest problems. How can a solution designed to protect crops lead to a worsening of the problem it was meant to solve? The paradox of the pesticides highlights the complex interaction between chemical control, evolutionary biology, and ecological balance. It forces us to reconsider the long-term consequences of pesticide use, the role of resistance evolution, and the sustainability of current agricultural practices. Let's explore the paradox of the pesticides, where chemical solutions and biological resistance collide in an unpredictable and counterproductive cycle. The paradox of the pesticides emerged as an unexpected consequence of the widespread use of chemical pesticides in the 20th century, particularly after World War II, when pesticides like DDT became popular for agricultural use. Initially, these chemicals seemed to provide a simple solution to pest control, offering increased agricultural productivity and a reduction in crop losses to insects, weeds, and other pests. The widespread belief was that pesticides could serve as a long-term solution to pest outbreaks, leading to a healthier, more stable food supply. However, by the 1950s and 1960s, scientists and farmers began to notice that pest populations were becoming resistant to pesticides. Insects and other pests that had been initially killed off by the chemicals were now surviving, reproducing, and passing on their resistant traits to future generations. The most notable example was the development of resistance to DDT, a chemical that had been hailed as a miracle solution to controlling pests like mosquitoes, which spread diseases like malaria. The paradox of the pesticides became clear as the initial success of pesticide use began to turn into a long-term problem. Instead of eradicating pests, the constant use of chemicals led to a vicious cycle where stronger and more toxic chemicals were needed to control increasingly resistant pest populations. This paradox has since become a key issue in agricultural science, environmental policy, and public health, raising concerns about the sustainability of chemical control and the need for more integrated pest management strategies. The paradox of the pesticides refers to a situation in which the use of pesticides, chemicals designed to eliminate pests, results in the evolution of pesticide resistance in pest populations, thereby reducing the effectiveness of the chemicals and creating a feedback loop of escalating pesticide use. What initially seems like an effective solution to pest control ultimately leads to more severe and persistent pest problems, creating long-term ecological and economic challenges. The paradox raises important questions about the effectiveness and sustainability of chemical-based pest control in modern agriculture. 1. The basics of pesticides and pest control. A. What are pesticides? Pesticides are chemical substances used to control pests, organisms that damage crops, spread diseases, or otherwise harm human activities. Pesticides include a wide range of chemicals designed to target different types of pests, such as insecticides to kill insects, herbicides to control fungal growth. They have been widely adopted in modern agriculture to protect crops, increase yields, and reduce the impact of pest outbreaks on food production. The appeal of pesticides lies in their effectiveness and immediacy. They can quickly reduce or eliminate pest populations and help ensure that crops are not destroyed. However, the widespread use of pesticides has led to unintended ecological consequences, particularly the development of pesticide resistance. B. The purpose of pest control. The purpose of pest control is to reduce the impact of pests on agricultural systems, thereby increasing crop yields and ensuring food security. Pests can damage crops in a variety of ways, including by eating plants, spreading diseases, or competing for resources. Historically, pest control methods ranged from manual labor, such as hand-picking insects off plants, to the use of natural predators, biological control. But the widespread introduction of synthetic pesticides in the mid-20th century revolutionized agricultural practices. offering farmers a quick and relatively easy solution to pest problems. Despite the benefits of pesticides in increasing agricultural productivity, their effectiveness is not permanent and can lead to resistance in pest populations, rendering the pesticides less effective over time. 2. The development of pesticide resistance. A. The evolution of resistance. The core of the paradox of the pesticides lies in the evolutionary process that occurs within pest populations when exposed to pesticides. Pesticide resistance happens when a small fraction of a pest population possesses genetic mutations that allow them to survive exposure to a pesticide. These resistant individuals reproduce, passing on their resistance genes to their offspring, and over time the population becomes dominated by resistant individuals. In some cases, resistance can develop very quickly, especially when pests are exposed to high doses of pesticides or when pesticides are used repeatedly without adequate breaks. Over time, pests evolve not only to survive, but to thrive in the presence of the chemicals designed to kill them. This evolutionary process is an example of natural selection, where the traits that allow pests to survive exposure to pesticides become more prevalent in the population. B. Examples of pesticide resistance. Pesticide resistance has been observed in many different pest species. One of the most famous examples is the resistance to DDT in mosquitoes, which has led to the resurgence of diseases like malaria in certain regions. Initially, DDT was extremely effective at controlling mosquito populations, but over time, mosquitoes developed resistance to the chemical. This led to the need for stronger and more toxic pesticides, which created an escalating cycle of resistance. Other examples of pesticide resistance include aphids, cockroaches, rats, and various agricultural pests that have developed resistance to widely used insecticides and herbicides. The development of resistance in these populations has led to increased pesticide use and a greater reliance on chemical solutions to control pest populations. 3. The paradox. More pesticides lead to more resistance. A. The vicious cycle of pesticide use. The paradox lies in the fact that increasing pesticide use leads to greater resistance, which in turn requires stronger pesticides to control pest populations. Initially, pesticides are effective at reducing pest numbers, but over time, the development of resistant strains forces farmers to increase pesticide applications. This feedback loop results in an ever-escalating cycle of pesticide use, where each generation of pests becomes more resistant, and each generation of pesticides becomes more toxic. This cycle can lead to the collapse of pest control strategies, as even the strongest pesticides may lose their effectiveness. Additionally, the overuse of pesticides can have negative environmental effects, including the destruction of beneficial organisms, contamination of water sources, and the development of resistant weeds. B. The environmental consequences of pesticide overuse. The overuse of pesticides can also have significant environmental consequences beyond the development of resistance. Pesticides often kill not only pests, but also non-target species, including pollinators like bees, predators that control pest populations naturally, and soil microorganisms that are essential for maintaining soil health. This creates a cascading effect throughout the ecosystem, where the loss of natural predators or beneficial organisms can further exacerbate pest problems, leading to even greater reliance on pesticides. In addition, the accumulation of pesticides in the environment can lead to pollution of soil, water, and air, affecting not just the target organisms but the entire ecosystem. The paradox becomes more pronounced as chemical warfare against pests inadvertently creates ecological imbalances and contributes to the decline of biodiversity. 4. Potential solutions and integrated pest management. A. Integrated pest management, IP/PM. One solution to the paradox of the pesticides is the concept of integrated pest management, IP. IP is a sustainable approach to pest control that combines a variety of methods, including biological control, cultural practices, and pesticides, to manage pest populations in a way that minimizes environmental impact and reduces the development of resistance. In IPM, pesticides are used judiciously and only when necessary, and the emphasis is placed on long-term strategies, such as promoting natural predators of pests, rotating crops, and managing agricultural practices to reduce pest populations in a way that does not rely solely on chemical solutions. By reducing the frequency and intensity of pesticide applications, IPM helps to slow down the evolution of resistance, and maintain more stable and resilient agricultural systems. By maintaining a diverse range of plant and animal species in and around farms, farmers can encourage the presence of natural predators, such as ladybugs, birds, and other beneficial insects that help control pest populations without the need for chemical pesticides. Biodiversity also helps to strengthen ecosystem resilience, reducing the reliance on pesticides and promoting sustainable farming practices. Sea policy and education governments and policymakers can also play a role in mitigating the paradox of the pesticides by implementing regulations that limit pesticide use, encourage the adoption of sustainable farming practices, and promote public education on the dangers of over-reliance on pesticides. Educating farmers and the public about the dangers of pesticide resistance and the benefits of alternative pest control strategies can help to shift agricultural practices towards more ecologically balanced solutions. 5. The long-term consequences of the pesticide paradox. A. Global food security and sustainability. The paradox of the pesticides is more than just a theoretical concept. It has real-world consequences for global food security and sustainability. As pest resistance grows and pesticides become less effective, there will be increasing pressure on food production systems to find alternative methods of pest control. Without a shift towards sustainable agricultural practices, the escalating cycle of pesticide use could lead to food shortages, higher food costs, and environmental degradation. The need for a holistic approach addressing the paradox of the pesticides requires a holistic approach that recognizes the interconnectedness of pest control, ecosystem health, and food security. By promoting integrated pest management, fostering biodiversity, and reducing the reliance on chemical pesticides, we can help to create more sustainable and resilient agricultural systems that balance the needs of farmers, consumers, and the environment. Washburn's paradox. Imagine an athlete or an artist who has spent years training and practicing, consistently striving to improve their skills and master their craft. They push themselves beyond their limits, but despite all their effort, they find themselves facing a plateau, a point where further progress seems impossible and they cannot break through to the next level of achievement. This is the Washburn's paradox, which highlights a curious phenomenon in the world of skill development. As individuals strive for excellence, the very pursuit of perfection can sometimes hinder their ability to progress. The paradox suggests that, at certain levels, the more focused we become on mastery and success, the more we may encounter obstacles in improving our abilities. Why does the act of striving for excellence sometimes lead to frustration and stagnation, rather than continuous improvement? The Washburn's paradox reveals how self-imposed pressure and the pursuit of idealized goals can create mental or emotional barriers that block progress. Let's explore the Washburn's paradox, where motivation, skill development, and self-imposed limits collide, challenging our understanding of how we approach the path to success. The Washburn's paradox was first proposed by the psychologist and motivation expert Harold Washburn in the mid-20th century. Washburn observed that many individuals who were highly motivated and dedicated to improving their skills in various fields, be it sports, arts, or academics, often found themselves hitting a mental block after a certain point. Despite the best efforts to improve and achieve, individuals would experience a frustrating plateau where progress would seemingly come to a halt. This phenomenon wasn't due to a lack of effort or skill, but was a result of an internal paradox in which the intense focus on achieving excellence paradoxically limited further progress. Washburn's work was rooted in the study of human motivation and the psychology of achievement, and he explored how various internal and external pressures affect personal development. His paradox emerged from the idea that individuals, especially those with high expectations and intrinsic motivation, can inadvertently create psychological barriers that impede their success. In particular, the intensity of motivation, when coupled with a strong desire for perfection, can increase self-criticism, stress, and fear of failure, all of which undermine the very process of growth. The Washburn's paradox has since become an important concept in psychology, sports psychology, and self-help circles, especially as it relates to goal setting, achievement, and the mental challenges of pursuing long-term success. It offers insights into how mental blocks and performance anxiety can negatively impact skill development, even when individuals are extremely capable and dedicated. The Washburn's paradox delves into the psychological tension between motivation and performance, particularly how high motivation can sometimes lead to mental blocks, preventing further improvement. This paradox is not about a lack of effort or skill, but about how mental barriers, created by the very desire for excellence, can prevent an individual from progressing. At the core of the Washburn's paradox lies the concept of motivation. Intrinsic motivation refers to engaging in an activity for its inherent satisfaction and enjoyment, while extrinsic motivation is driven by external rewards or recognition, such as money, fame, or success. Individuals with a high level of intrinsic motivation often seek personal growth, self-improvement, and the challenge of achieving their full potential. While intrinsic motivation is often associated with long-term success and commitment, the paradox emerges when this motivation becomes too intense or focused. When individuals put too much pressure on themselves to achieve, they may inadvertently block their progress by becoming overly critical, stressed, or fearful of failure. This internal conflict creates a mental barrier which leads to stagnation, even if the individual is highly dedicated and skilled. Perfectionism plays a crucial role in the Washburn's paradox, as the relentless pursuit of perfection can be both a strength and a weakness. On one hand, perfectionism drives individuals to improve their skills and performance. On the other hand, when the drive for perfection becomes overwhelming, it can lead to self-doubt, burnout, and increased pressure, all of which are counterproductive to skill development. Perfectionists are often overly critical of themselves and their performance, which can lead to mental fatigue and a fear of failure. The constant desire to meet high standards can prevent them from experimenting, taking risks, or embracing imperfection, all of which are essential for growth. As a result, perfectionism can cause individuals to plateau, unable to break through to the next level of proficiency. In the process of learning and skill development, a plateau refers to a period of time when progress slows down or appears to come to a complete halt. This is a common experience for individuals trying to develop their skills in sports, music, academics, or any other area of personal growth. The plateau effect is frustrating because, despite consistent effort and practice, improvement seems stagnant. The Washburn's paradox explains that the mental pressure created by the desire to progress and achieve perfection can lead to a self-imposed plateau. In this scenario, individuals may find themselves stuck at a certain level of skill because their over-focus on excellence or perfection causes them to overthink their performance or become too self-critical. This over-analysis of their abilities can prevent them from adopting the trial-and-error approach that is often necessary to make further progress. The mental block is a crucial element in the Washburn's paradox. As individuals strive for self-improvement, they can develop psychological barriers that hinder their ability to improve further. These blocks often stem from anxiety, fear of failure, or the overwhelming desire to be perfect. In sports psychology, this phenomenon is referred to as the yips, a condition where athletes, despite having the technical ability to perform a task, experience sudden, involuntary mental blocks that prevent them from succeeding. The same concept applies to musicians, writers, and others engaged in creative or performance-based endeavors. The paradox emerges when an individual's self-imposed pressure to succeed becomes the very thing that prevents them from breaking through their plateau. Self-criticism is another major factor contributing to the Washburn's paradox. While self-reflection and self-awareness are important for growth, excessive self-criticism can be detrimental to performance. Individuals with high levels of self-criticism often focus on their shortcomings rather than their strengths. This constant evaluation leads to doubt and frustration, which can further impede their progress. The paradox is that the more an individual criticizes their lack of improvement, the more pressure they put on themselves, which can create a feedback loop of negative thoughts and emotions. This mental cycle can result in reduced performance and an increased sense of inadequacy, making it harder to push through the plateau and continue developing their skills. The Washburn's paradox suggests that finding a balance between self-criticism and self-compassion is key to overcoming plateaus. Individuals who are able to be kind to themselves, embrace their imperfections, and view setbacks as a natural part of the learning process tend to recover from plateaus more quickly. Self-compassion allows individuals to continue working hard without being overwhelmed by unrealistic expectations or fear of failure. When individuals stop focusing solely on flawless performance and instead embrace their growth, they are able to break through mental barriers and continue improving their skills. The Washburn's paradox is closely tied to the concept of goal setting. High-achieving individuals often set ambitious goals for themselves, which can create immense pressure. While goal setting is essential for success, setting goals that are too high or unrealistic can lead to frustration when progress slows down or plateaus. The paradox emerges when individuals set out to achieve perfect outcomes, which creates unrealistic expectations. This makes it harder to enjoy the journey of improvement and can lead to burnout. For example, an athlete who wants to break a world record may focus so intensely on that goal that they become frustrated by the small gains they are making, instead of recognizing the significant improvements they've already achieved. The Washburn's paradox suggests that adjustable and flexible goals are more effective for long-term success. Instead of focusing solely on the end result, individuals should focus on incremental improvement and celebrate small wins. By breaking larger goals into manageable steps, individuals can maintain motivation and momentum even when they face setbacks or plateaus. Setting realistic, achievable goals allows individuals to track their progress without feeling overwhelmed by the pressure to be perfect. The paradox teaches us that success is often a journey of continuous improvement rather than a fixed destination. In sports psychology, the Washburn's paradox offers important insights into how athletes can overcome mental blocks, cope with the pressure to perform, and continue progressing. Athletes who experience mental plateaus can benefit from techniques that promote self-compassion, relaxation, and mental flexibility. Learning to embrace setbacks as part of the process of growth, rather than as failures, can help athletes break free from the paradox. The Washburn's paradox also has implications for personal development and creativity. Writers, musicians, and other creatives often experience periods of stagnation when their desire for perfection prevents them from producing new work. By focusing on the process of creation rather than the product, individuals can overcome creative blocks and continue to develop their craft. Bootstrap Paradox. What if I told you that a person could exist without ever being created? That a book, idea, or object could have no origin? An object that was always there but never truly created? This is the heart of the Bootstrap Paradox, a mind-bending concept that questions the very nature of cause and effect. Imagine you travel back in time and give Shakespeare a copy of one of his famous works, Hamlet, which he then reads and subsequently writes himself, thus creating the play. Now, the paradox. Who created Hamlet? Was it Shakespeare, or was it you who travelled back in time? The Bootstrap Paradox explores the idea of self-creation or causal loops, where something exists without a clear origin or beginning because it has been passed through time without a true point of creation. The paradox plays with the concept of time travel, causality, and temporal loops, where events cause themselves, challenging our understanding of how time and events are supposed to unfold. Let's dive deep into the Bootstrap Paradox, a riddle that forces us to reconsider the relationship between past, present, and future, where objects, ideas, and even people seem to exist without ever being truly created. The Bootstrap Paradox, also known as a causal loop, is a time travel paradox that has captured the imagination of philosophers, physicists, and science fiction writers. The term bootstrap comes from the idea of pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, a metaphor for self-creation or self-sufficiency without any external influence. The concept has been explored in various forms throughout the history of science fiction, but its deeper philosophical implications and its relationship to causality became more widely discussed in the 20th century, particularly as time travel theories gained traction in popular culture. One of the earliest mentions of the Bootstrap Paradox came from Robert Heinlein's 1941 science fiction novel By His Bootstraps. The novel features a time traveller who meets a version of himself from the future and through a series of events essentially creates himself in a loop that has no clear origin. In the novel, a book becomes the central object that gets passed through time, just as in the common interpretation of the paradox, where an object is sent back in time and its creation is attributed to a loop with no external origin. The paradox received broader attention with the advent of time travel movies like Back to the Future, 1985, where characters interact with their past selves and create events that result in a self-fulfilling loop. The paradox poses a serious philosophical dilemma regarding causality, challenging our understanding of the linear progression of events and whether time can be truly circular. The Bootstrap Paradox forces us to question whether events can exist without cause, or if they are part of a never-ending cycle that loops back upon itself. The Bootstrap Paradox is a fundamental riddle in the realm of time travel, causality, and the nature of time. The paradox occurs when an object, piece of information, or person is sent back in time, and the timeline loops in such a way that the object or idea has no true origin. The paradox challenges our understanding of cause and effect because the object or idea seems to exist without being created, as it was passed back in time by its future self. The core of the Bootstrap Paradox lies in the concept of self-creation. A time traveller travels back in time and gives Shakespeare a copy of Hamlet, which Shakespeare then copies and claims as his own creation. Now, the question arises, who created Hamlet? Was it Shakespeare? Or was it the time traveller who brought the play back to him? Both individuals seem to have created the play, but there is no origin for the play itself, because it's as if the play came from nowhere and exists without a true creator. This paradox is often illustrated with a book, object, or idea that is passed from the future to the past in such a way that its existence creates a temporal loop. The object or idea simply exists, having no definitive point in time where it was created. This is where the term bootstrap comes in, the concept of self-generation or self-existence that defies traditional causality. The Bootstrap Paradox exists within the broader concept of causal loops in time travel. A causal loop is a scenario in which a cause and effect are reversed or intertwined in such a way that the effect itself becomes the cause. In the case of the Bootstrap Paradox, an object or idea creates itself by traveling backward in time. The paradox raises profound questions about the nature of time, whether time can truly loop back on itself, and how we can understand the origins of things in such a system. The key to understanding this paradox is the temporal loop, in which an event is its own cause. This challenges the classical understanding of linear time, where one event leads to another in a unidirectional flow. In a causal loop, the timeline seems to fold in on itself, and the past, present, and future are no longer distinct and sequential, but rather a circular system in which events cause each other across time. The Bootstrap Paradox is a type of temporal circuit. In this circuit, events from the future influence the past, and those past events ultimately cause the future events to occur in the first place. This creates a closed loop with no clear beginning or end, an infinite loop that has no origin point. The object or idea that is passed through time is essentially a perpetual motion machine. It exists without being created or destroyed. In the case of the Shakespeare example, the play exists because it was passed back in time. Shakespeare did not create it by himself, he only received it from the time traveller. The play never truly originates from any one person. Its creation is a result of the time loop. This concept raises several philosophical questions. Can something exist without cause? If an object has no clear origin, what does that say about our understanding of time and causality? Does this paradox imply that time is not linear, but rather a circular or recursive system? The paradox forces us to reconsider our basic assumptions about causality and the direction of time. Another version of the Bootstrap Paradox involves information rather than physical objects. For instance, imagine a time traveller who goes back in time to give a scientist a set of blueprints for a revolutionary invention. The scientist then builds the invention, which the time traveller uses in the future to go back in time to give the scientist the blueprints in the first place. Here, the blueprints exist, but they have no origin. They are passed from the future to the past, creating a paradox where the information exists without a clear source. This paradox is similar to the informational bootstrap, where knowledge, ideas, or inventions seem to come from nowhere, having no true inventor or creator. The cycle continues perpetually, with the invention or idea existing because it is passed backward in time, but never originating at any point in history. One possible solution to the Bootstrap Paradox is the multiverse hypothesis, which suggests that every action in time travel may create an alternative timeline or universe. In this scenario, the loop does not take place in a single timeline, but rather in an infinite set of timelines, where the object or idea exists in one timeline and is then passed to a parallel universe where it is used to create itself. The multiverse hypothesis allows for the existence of self-created objects and ideas without violating the principles of causality, as each event occurs in a different timeline. However, this solution raises other questions, such as how do we define the boundaries of parallel universes? If the object or idea exists in multiple timelines, which one is considered the true origin of the object? Another potential solution is the Novikov self-consistency principle, which posits that events in a time loop will always unfold in such a way that no paradox occurs. According to this principle, if time travel were possible, the events in the loop would always unfold to preserve the consistency of the timeline. In the case of the Bootstrap Paradox, this principle would suggest that the loop is always self-consistent, meaning the play or idea would always exist in this loop, with no contradictions or causal paradoxes. The Novikov principle allows for causal loops without violating the laws of physics, but it also suggests that the past is fixed, and time travel cannot be used to alter events. The Bootstrap Paradox challenges the very concept of causality, the idea that events have a clear cause and effect. In the case of a self-created object, we cannot trace a linear cause for its existence. This raises deeper philosophical questions about the nature of time, cause and effect, and the direction in which time flows. The arrow of time, a concept in thermodynamics and cosmology, suggests that time moves in one direction, forward. The Bootstrap Paradox presents a challenge to this idea, as it introduces the possibility of events that loop back on themselves, disrupting the concept of linear time. The Bootstrap Paradox also has parallels with self-referential paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, e.g., this sentence is false. Just as self-referential statements can lead to contradictions, so too does the Bootstrap Paradox, where an object or idea seems to exist without origin, creating a logical loop that is difficult to resolve. The paradox forces us to reconsider the nature of self-referential paradoxes in both logic and time. Grandfather Paradox. Imagine you have the ability to travel back in time to the moment before your grandfather was born. In this moment, you make a critical decision. You inadvertently prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, thus ensuring that your parents never meet, and ultimately, you are never born. If you were never born, how could you have travelled back in time in the first place to alter this event? This is the heart of the Grandfather Paradox, a mind-bending time travel dilemma that forces us to confront the contradictions of causality. If you can change the past, how does it affect the future? The paradox suggests that time travel may create a logical loop of events that would make your existence impossible, creating an irreconcilable contradiction. Can you change history without erasing yourself from existence? The Grandfather Paradox raises crucial questions about the nature of time, cause and effect, and the potential consequences of altering the past. Let's explore the Grandfather Paradox, where time travel and causality meet in a mind-bending loop that challenges our understanding of reality. The Grandfather Paradox is one of the most famous thought experiments in the philosophy of time travel, dating back to the 20th century. The paradox was first introduced by René Barjavel, a French writer, in his 1943 novel Le Voyageur Imprudent, The Imprudent Traveller. The paradox gained widespread attention in the 1960s, after physicist Kurt Gödel and others began exploring the implications of time travel in the context of general relativity and causality. The Grandfather Paradox is often cited in discussions about the logical consequences of time travel and how altering events in the past could lead to contradictory outcomes. If a time traveller were to go back and change an event that was crucial to their own existence, it creates a logical loop where the traveller could never have existed in the first place to make that change. Although the paradox was first articulated in science fiction, it has been studied in the fields of philosophy, physics, and metaphysics. The paradox has sparked debates about the possibility of time travel and whether time itself is fixed or mutable. It also raises important questions about the nature of causality and the rules that govern the universe. The Grandfather Paradox remains a cornerstone of discussions about time travel, causality, and the complexities of changing history. The Grandfather Paradox is a classic thought experiment in the study of time travel that explores the potential contradictions that arise when an individual attempts to change the past. The paradox is grounded in the fundamental principles of causality, which assert that events in the past lead to consequences in the future. However, the paradox arises when a time traveller alters an event in the past that is essential to their own existence, creating a logical loop or contradiction. Causality is the principle that every event, or cause, has a consequence that follows in time. In the context of time travel, causality assumes that the future is the inevitable result of the past. The Grandfather Paradox challenges this concept by suggesting that if you alter an event in the past, such as preventing your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, it could change the course of events in such a way that you would never be born. This introduces a contradiction. If you were never born, then you could not have traveled back in time in the first place to prevent the meeting of your grandfather and grandmother. The paradox lies in the fact that if you change the past in this way, it creates a logical loop where your very existence becomes impossible, but your attempt to change the past would have already taken place. Time travel is a concept that has fascinated philosophers, scientists, and writers for centuries. While time travel to the future is theoretically possible, according to Einstein's theory of relativity, time travel to the past presents significant logical paradoxes. If time travel were possible, it raises questions about the nature of time and the structure of the universe. In the case of the grandfather paradox, the crux of the issue is the assumption that changing the past could directly affect the future. This would imply that time is not linear or deterministic, but instead mutable, which creates a potential conflict between different timelines and the causal chain of events. The paradox highlights the difficulties in reconciling time travel with our understanding of cause and effect. Imagine a scenario where a person named Alex travels back in time to a moment before their grandfather was born. In this scenario, Alex prevents their grandfather from meeting their grandmother, thus ensuring that Alex's parents never meet, and ultimately Alex is never born. If Alex is never born, how could they have travelled back in time in the first place to alter the event? The logical contradiction arises because Alex's actions in the past undermine the possibility of their own existence, creating a paradox. The paradox is rooted in the idea that time is causal. If A causes B, then A must always precede B. However, if Alex changes event A, the meeting of the grandparents, it causes event B, Alex's birth, to no longer occur. This creates an inconsistent timeline, where Alex can neither exist to make the change nor not make the change, since the change would prevent their existence. The Bootstrap Paradox is closely related to the grandfather paradox. It refers to a situation where an object or piece of information exists without ever having been created. In the context of the grandfather paradox, the question arises, if Alex changes the past to prevent their birth, where did Alex come from to begin with? This creates a causal loop, where events in time are self-sorganating without a clear beginning or end. In the case of the grandfather paradox, the fact that Alex changes the past creates a loop that has no resolution. Alex's existence is dependent on the very event they are trying to prevent, which creates an infinite loop of events. This makes the grandfather paradox a powerful illustration of the difficulties in reconciling time travel with logical causality. One potential solution to the grandfather paradox is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. According to this theory, when a time traveler alters an event in the past, they create a new parallel timeline or alternate reality, separate from the original one. In this scenario, Alex could travel back in time, prevent the meeting of their grandparents, and still exist in the original timeline as part of a separate world or parallel universe. In the many worlds framework, every time a choice is made that would alter the past, it splits the timeline, creating multiple realities in which different outcomes occur. This would eliminate the contradiction by suggesting that the past has been altered, but the original timeline remains unchanged. As a result, Alex could travel back in time, make the change, and still exist in a new timeline where the event occurs differently. Another possible resolution to the grandfather paradox is the Novikov self-consistency principle, which posits that events in the past are self-consistent and cannot be altered in such a way as to create a contradiction. According to this principle, even if time travel to the past were possible, the laws of physics would prevent any actions that would create logical inconsistencies. In other words, if Alex were to travel back in time to prevent their grandfather from meeting their grandmother, something would occur to prevent Alex from carrying out that action. Perhaps they would be stopped, or events would unfold in such a way that the meeting still happens. This principle suggests that while time travel to the past might be theoretically possible, the timeline would adjust itself to ensure that no paradoxes occur. Essentially, time would correct itself to maintain causal consistency, making it impossible for Alex to change history in a way that would prevent their own existence. A closed time-like curve, CTC, is another theoretical concept that might resolve the grandfather paradox. ACTC refers to a loop in space-time that allows an object to travel through time and return to its starting point. In ACTC, the past and future are interwoven and events can occur in a self-consistent manner. For example, in a CTC, Alex could go back in time, alter events and still exist, because the timeline would loop around in such a way that the actions Alex takes do not disrupt their own existence. CTCs are consistent with the general theory of relativity, which allows for the possibility of closed loops in space-time. However, the existence of CTCs has not been proven, and they remain a theoretical concept in the realm of space-time and quantum mechanics. The grandfather paradox raises fundamental questions about the nature of time. Is time a fixed, linear sequence of events, or is it mutable and subject to change? If time is fixed, then any attempt to alter the past would be impossible or self-correcting. This would align with the Novikov principle, or the many worlds interpretation. However, if time is mutable, it might allow for infinite timelines or the possibility of changing history, leading to paradoxes like the grandfather paradox. The paradox invites us to reconsider how we perceive the relationship between past, present, and future, and how time travel could fit into this framework. Ultimately, the grandfather paradox challenges our basic assumptions about the flow of time, causality, and the possibility of altering history. Bracketing paradox. Imagine that you are faced with a moral dilemma. You must choose between two actions, one that will benefit society but harm a few individuals, and another that will cause minimal harm but lead to broader societal consequences. How do you make the right decision? The bracketing paradox explores the tension between ethical decision-making and logical constraints. In many real-world scenarios, individuals or organizations are forced to make decisions under strict constraints or conditions that prevent them from acting in the way they would consider morally ideal. The paradox arises when the need to follow external rules, such as laws, policies, or logical reasoning frameworks, conflicts with the moral or ethical decisions that would normally be made. How can one reconcile following rigid frameworks with acting in a way that aligns with personal or societal ethical standards? Can logical structures and moral imperatives coexist without causing contradictions? The bracketing paradox forces us to confront the inherent limitations of ethical reasoning within confined or predefined systems, revealing the tension between ideal ethics and logical constraints. Let's explore the bracketing paradox, where decision-making, logic, and ethics intersect in a challenging and often paradoxical way. The bracketing paradox comes from the philosophical and logical exploration of decision-making processes within constrained systems. In its simplest form, it arises when a person or organization faces a moral or ethical dilemma, but is constrained by external rules, frameworks, or logical boundaries that shape how decisions are made. While ethical decision-making allows for moral flexibility and individual autonomy, decision-making within a logical framework requires strict adherence to rules and constraints that may contradict ethical intentions. This paradox has its roots in the study of ethics and philosophy of action, where many moral dilemmas present a conflict between rules and ethics. For example, in a utilitarian framework, one might be required to act in a way that maximizes the overall good, even if it means sacrificing the individual. This runs into conflict when considering individual rights and human dignity, creating a tension that is explored in the bracketing paradox. The term itself is often associated with ethical decision-making in constrained environments, such as in business, political systems, or legal frameworks, where individuals are forced to bracket their moral considerations to meet the requirements of external obligations or rules. Philosophers and ethicists have long debated how to reconcile logic with moral imperatives, with some suggesting that these external constraints may limit human freedom or result in compromised ethical judgments. The bracketing paradox continues to be relevant in modern debates about ethical frameworks in fields like artificial intelligence, legal ethics, and policymaking. The bracketing paradox emerges in decision-making processes that require individuals or organizations to act within predefined constraints, whether those constraints are legal, ethical, or logical in nature. In these situations, ethical considerations may conflict with the rules governing decision-making, creating a moral tension where the ideal ethical decision seems to be at odds with the decision required by external systems. 1. Ethical decision-making and constraints. A. Ethical dilemmas and moral reasoning. Ethical decision-making often involves choosing between two or more actions that lead to different outcomes, each with its own set of moral consequences. For example, the famous trolley problem asks individuals to decide whether to pull a lever to divert a runaway trolley onto a track where it will kill one person to save 5 others. Here, individuals must navigate the tension between utilitarian ethics, which promotes the greatest good for the greatest number, and deontological ethics, which emphasizes the importance of individual rights and moral rules. In situations like this, there is no perfect solution. Instead, people must make decisions based on their moral frameworks, which can be personal or culturally determined. The bracketing paradox arises when an individual is forced to choose between ideal ethical decisions, those that align with their personal moral compass, and logical constraints, those that are imposed by rules, systems, or frameworks outside their control. B. External constraints, rules and systems. External constraints in decision-making can come from a variety of sources. These may include legal frameworks, laws that dictate what actions are permissible or required, institutional rules, policies or procedures set by organizations or authorities, logical frameworks, rules of logic or reason that define how decisions must be made, regardless of ethical considerations, social norms, cultural or societal expectations that influence how decisions should be made. These constraints often require individuals to act in ways that might not align with their moral beliefs. For example, a doctor may feel ethically obliged to provide care to a patient, but if hospital policy or insurance rules prevent this, the doctor must bracket their moral obligation to comply with external systems. 2. The conflict between ethics and logic. A. The role of logic in decision-making. In the context of the bracketing paradox, logic refers to the predefined rules that structure how decisions should be made. This could involve legal reasoning, rational analysis, or following standardized procedures that prioritize consistency and predictability. For example, in the context of artificial intelligence, machines are programmed to make decisions based on logical algorithms. These systems operate on if-then rules and algorithms that do not take moral considerations into account. A self-driving car may be programmed to prioritize the safety of its passengers above all else, but this could lead to a situation where the car is forced to make a decision that harms pedestrians or other drivers. This creates a conflict between the moral implications of saving lives and the logical imperative to maximize safety for the car's occupants. The bracketing paradox occurs when a person or system must choose between following logical frameworks, which may not align with ethical ideals, and ethical considerations, which may violate logical or rule-based constraints. B. The consequences of prioritizing logic over ethics. When logic is prioritized over ethics, it can lead to decisions that are technically correct, but morally problematic. For example, consider a corporate executive who follows the rules of a company's financial reporting system, but, in doing so, overlooks the harm done to workers or the environment. While the decision may adhere to the logic of profit maximization and cost reduction, it could have detrimental effects on the well-being of employees or communities. Similarly, in a legal system, a judge might be required to sentence a person according to the law, even if they believe the person deserves mercy or rehabilitation. This strict adherence to legal logic can result in outcomes that feel unjust or morally wrong. In such cases, the bracketing paradox arises because the decision-maker feels compelled to act within the constraints of the system, even though they may feel that their actions conflict with their ethical principles. 3. The ethics of bracketing. Navigating moral constraints. A. The principle of moral integrity. One approach to addressing the bracketing paradox is to emphasize the importance of moral integrity. This involves maintaining consistency between one's actions and moral beliefs, even when faced with external constraints. For instance, a whistleblower might expose wrongdoing within an organization, despite the risk of retribution or legal consequences, choosing to act in alignment with ethical principles rather than comply with the institutional rules that encourage unethical behavior. In situations where external constraints are rigid, individuals may be forced to make difficult choices that prioritize their moral integrity over the logical rules. This kind of decision-making involves making ethical compromises or risking personal consequences in order to stay true to one's values. B. Navigating compromise and conflict. While some situations demand a clear ethical stance, many involve complex moral compromises. The bracketing paradox asks whether it is possible to maintain moral integrity when bound by a system of rules that may not allow for ethical flexibility. In the example of the doctor constrained by insurance rules, the doctor must choose whether to follow institutional guidelines or find ways to make ethical decisions within those boundaries. The paradox also extends to systems where the rules themselves may be flawed. In such cases, individuals may be faced with a choice between adhering to a flawed logic or finding ways to restructure the rules to align with ethical values. This dilemma challenges decision-makers to find creative solutions to balance external constraints with moral considerations. 4. Broader implications of the bracketing paradox. A. Ethics in artificial intelligence and technology. The bracketing paradox is especially relevant in discussions of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. AI systems are designed to operate according to logical frameworks. They follow rules and make decisions based on data and algorithms. However, these systems often do not consider ethical nuances in their decision-making, which can lead to decisions that, while logically sound, may not align with human ethical standards. This paradox raises important questions about how to create ethically aligned AI that balances logical decision-making with moral considerations. As AI systems become more integrated into sectors such as healthcare, transportation, and law enforcement, the challenge of ethical programming will become more pressing, especially when these systems are forced to make life-and-death decisions. Be it the role of institutions and governance in political and legal systems, the bracketing paradox plays out when institutions or governments enforce policies that may conflict with moral ideals. For example, a government might impose austerity measures that harm vulnerable populations, justifying these actions through economic logic. Citizens and policymakers must decide whether to accept these rules or challenge them to better reflect ethical values. Institutions must grapple with the balance between upholding laws and adhering to ethical standards. Legal scholars and ethicists often debate whether institutions should be more flexible in accommodating ethical principles, or whether they should strictly adhere to legal logic to ensure predictability and fairness. 5. Conclusion: embracing the bracketing paradox. A. The importance of flexibility and innovation. The bracketing paradox invites us to reconsider how we navigate the tension between logic and ethics in decision-making. In many cases, external constraints can limit our ability to make the most ethical decision, but there are opportunities for creative problem-solving within those constraints. Embracing the paradox means recognizing that while ethical ideals are important, we must also be aware of the limitations imposed by rules and systems. B. Reconciling logic and morality. Ultimately, the bracketing paradox encourages us to find ways to reconcile logic and morality by understanding that ethical decisions are not always black and white, and that navigating complex moral dilemmas often requires flexibility, compromise, and, in some cases, a willingness to challenge established systems. Carroll's paradox. Imagine you are traveling through time, but with a twist. As you move forward in time, events begin to happen in reverse order. A ball that once bounced upward now falls back down. A glass that was shattered now reassembles itself. You experience a world where causes and effects are reversed, and the natural flow of time is reversed. A world where the past is seen as the future. This is the essence of Carroll's paradox, named after Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and a mathematician who explored paradoxes of time and causality. The paradox challenges our conventional understanding of time, causality, and events in the universe. If time can flow in both directions, how can we define cause and effect? Can the concept of future events be influenced by the past? Let's explore Carroll's paradox, a puzzle of time travel, reverse causality, and the nature of events in an ever-changing world. Carroll's paradox is a philosophical and logical paradox proposed by Lewis Carroll, the pen name of Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, the British author and mathematician best known for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. While Carroll is famous for his whimsical stories, he was also a logician with a deep interest in paradoxes and the philosophical implications of time and causality. In his works, Carroll often explored the concept of time and cause and effect in playful yet thought-provoking ways. Carroll's paradox arises from the thought experiment in which time flows in reverse and events seem to unfold backward, with effects preceding causes. The paradox challenges our everyday experience of time, where we assume a clear forward progression. Causes happen first, followed by effects. The paradox questions the fundamental assumptions of causality and time travel, proposing that in a world where time could flow backward, the normal order of events might be reversed. This creates an intriguing logical challenge about the nature of causes, effects, and the directionality of time. Though Carroll's paradox was not as widely recognized in mainstream philosophy at the time, its impact on modern philosophy of time and causality became more evident as time travel paradoxes were explored in science fiction and quantum mechanics in later years. Today, Carroll's paradox is seen as a precursor to more formal discussions about causal loops, reverse causality, and the directionality of time. The Carroll's paradox presents a fascinating challenge to our understanding of time, causality, and the sequence of events. The paradox is based on a scenario where time doesn't follow the typical forward progression we experience in everyday life, but instead flows backward, creating a situation where effects happen before causes. This raises deep questions about the nature of time travel, the direction of causality, and the logical consistency of reversing the flow of events. Let's break down the paradox, explore its implications, and understand how it relates to the concepts of time, causality, and events. Carroll's paradox begins with the premise of time travel and reverse causality. In this thought experiment, the laws of cause and effect are reversed, and the natural flow of time no longer proceeds from the past to the future, but instead from the future to the past. This creates a series of contradictions, where events seem to unwind in the opposite direction, and the normal relationship between causes and effects no longer holds. Imagine a world in which time flows backward. Events occur in reverse. A person watching a sequence of events might see a shattered glass gradually reassemble itself, or a broken vase restore itself to its original form. Causality is reversed. In this world, the effect precedes the cause. For example, an action might take place after its outcome rather than before it. The ball that falls from a table rises back up, seemingly moving against gravity. The passage of time is experienced backward. In such a world, actions, decisions, and movements occur in reverse order, and we might feel as though we are moving backward in time, revisiting past events in a manner that feels completely unnatural. At the heart of Carroll's paradox is the question: if time flows in reverse, can we still meaningfully talk about cause and effect? Can actions in the future influence events that have already occurred? If effects precede causes, does the normal order of temporal events still make sense? This paradox forces us to reconsider the structure of time itself, especially when it comes to reversible events and time travel. In the Carroll's paradox, the usual relationship between cause and effect is turned on its head. Typically, we think of causes as precedents to effects. Actions lead to outcomes, and we observe events in chronological order. However, in a world where time flows backward, effects happen first and causes follow. This reversal creates a logical paradox. If an effect occurs before its cause, how can we explain the directionality of time? For example, if a glass shatters, we typically understand this as the cause, a force acting on the glass, resulting in the effect, the glass breaking. But in the world of Carroll's paradox, we would observe the glass reassembling and later understand that the force of shattering must have occurred after the glass was already whole. This backward flow of causality creates confusion about the direction of change and whether we can still rely on our understanding of cause and effect. The Carroll's paradox also gives rise to temporal loops and causal loops, which are a common feature in time travel paradoxes. If events unfold in reverse, then the future could potentially cause the past, creating situations where causes and effects influence each other in a circular manner. Consider the example of time travel paradoxes. Imagine a time traveler going back in time and changing a past event. In traditional time travel stories, the time traveler's actions create a causal loop where the past is influenced by the future, leading to self-consistency in the timeline. But in Carroll's paradox, the idea that the future can influence the past is taken to an extreme, where effects precede causes in a temporal cycle that continually loops backward. These loops are often framed as grandfather paradoxes or bootstrap paradoxes, where an event in the future causes itself in the past. In Carroll's scenario, we would observe that the effect of an event in the past must be caused by something in the future, which creates a logical contradiction that cannot easily be resolved. The paradox reveals the logical limits of time travel and challenges our fundamental understanding of causal relationships in the universe. One of the most intriguing aspects of Carroll's paradox is its challenge to the concept of the arrow of time. In physics, the arrow of time refers to the one-way direction of time, from the past to the future, dictated by the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy tends to increase over time. This increase in entropy is often used to explain the unidirectional flow of time, where time always moves forward, from past to future. In Carroll's paradox, however, time appears to move backward, creating a reversal of entropy and a reversal of the arrow of time. If events can unfold backward, then the usual concept of time as an irreversible flow becomes problematic. In this reversed timeline, the entropy decreases, and the universe's state of disorder would be reduced over time. In the realm of quantum mechanics, certain physical processes are reversible, meaning that they can go forward or backward in time without violating the laws of physics. This concept of time reversibility suggests that time is not strictly unidirectional at the quantum level, and particles can interact in ways that don't violate causality. However, when we move from quantum scale to macroscopic scale, large objects like planets, humans, or wheels, the concept of time reversal becomes less clear. The Carroll's paradox illustrates how macroscopic events, like causes leading to effects, are governed by the arrow of time, whereas microscopic processes may not always respect the same rules of time. The paradox serves as a reminder of the tension between classical mechanics and quantum mechanics in understanding the true nature of time and causality. One way to resolve Carroll's paradox is through the block universe theory of time. This theory suggests that time is not a flowing stream, but rather a four-dimensional block where the past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. In this model, all events are fixed in a space-time continuum, and causality can be understood as a deterministic relationship between events, even if time appears to flow backward or forward. In this framework, the backward flow of time in Carroll's paradox doesn't lead to a contradiction because the entire timeline is seen as a static block. Events in the future can be connected to the past within the block, and time's directionality becomes a matter of perspective rather than a physical law. Another solution comes from rethinking the arrow of time itself. Instead of seeing time as an absolute, irreversible flow, it may be more useful to consider time's directionality as emergent from the underlying laws of physics. The second law of thermodynamics dictates that entropy increases in a closed system, but this doesn't necessarily imply that time flows in one direction. It only implies that the universe tends toward greater disorder over time. In the context of Carroll's paradox, time could still be understood as reversible at a fundamental level, but the macroscopic experience of time, in the world, results in a subjective perception of time moving in one direction. The paradox reminds us that our perception of time and causality is shaped by our experience, not necessarily by fundamental physics. Carroll's paradox has implications for time travel and the study of causal loops in science fiction. The paradox raises important questions about the consistency of events and whether future events can affect the past without violating the laws of causality. In time travel fiction, we often see characters interacting with their past selves, creating causal paradoxes. Carroll's paradox suggests that if time were reversible, these paradoxes would be more than just fiction. They would be inevitable logical consequences of the structure of the universe. The paradox also has deep philosophical implications for our understanding of free will and determinism. If future events can influence the past, this raises questions about agency and responsibility. Carroll's paradox forces us to consider how causality operates in a universe of reversed time and how we might interpret our actions in such a scenario. Paradox. Imagine you're standing at the opening of a long, narrow tube filled with gas molecules. The gas is flowing through the tube and everything seems normal. But here's the paradox. The flow of gas, which we often assume behaves in predictable, continuous ways, seems to defy that expectation when the tube gets small enough. The Knudsen paradox arises when the gas molecules start to behave in a way that's completely different from what we observe in bulk flow. As the diameter of the tube decreases, the gas no longer behaves as a continuous fluid. Instead, the flow becomes influenced by the individual molecular interactions and the discrete nature of gas molecules. The paradox is that, while fluid dynamics typically deals with smooth, continuous flow, Knudsen's flow occurs in situations where molecular motion takes over and classical fluid mechanics no longer applies. How can we explain this change in behavior, and how do we reconcile the flow of gas at a molecular level with the macroscopic behavior we observe? Let's explore the Knudsen paradox, where molecular motion and fluid dynamics meet in surprising ways. The Knudsen paradox is named after the Danish physicist Molecular Knudsen, who made important contributions to the understanding of gas dynamics in confined spaces. The paradox emerged from Knudsen's studies on the behavior of gases in narrow tubes and small-scale environments. In classical fluid dynamics, gases are modeled as continuous media, and their flow is described by equations such as the Navier-Stokes equations, which assume a continuous flow with smooth gradients of velocity. However, when the gas moves through very narrow spaces, where the diameter of the tube is comparable to or smaller than the mean free path of the gas molecules, the gas begins to behave differently than predicted by these equations. Knudsen's paradox arose when he recognized that in these microenvironments, the gas molecules interact more with the boundaries of the tube than with one another. This creates a shift in the flow behavior, and the classical approach to describing fluid motion no longer holds. Instead of treating the gas as a continuous fluid, Knudsen's work showed that the individual molecular interactions become significant. In essence, the Knudsen regime occurs when the effects of molecular motion are more important than the smooth, continuous behavior described by classical fluid mechanics. This insight led to new approaches in molecular dynamics, particularly in situations where gases interact with surfaces, and has become crucial in areas such as nanotechnology and the study of microfluidic systems. The Knudsen paradox explores the transition from classical fluid mechanics, which describes gases as a continuous medium, to the molecular dynamics that govern the behavior of gases when they are confined in narrow spaces. When gases are in macroscopic containers, they behave predictably according to fluid dynamics, with smooth gradients of velocity and pressure. However, when the gas flow is restricted to very narrow tubes or confined spaces, something strange happens. The gas starts to behave according to the principles of molecular motion, leading to the Knudsen paradox. The Knudsen paradox arises in situations where gas flows through a narrow tube or a small-scale system, and the mean free path of the gas molecules becomes comparable to the dimensions of the tube. The mean free path is the average distance a gas molecule travels before colliding with another molecule. In normal gas flow, where the tube is large enough that the molecules collide frequently, the fluid dynamics of the gas can be described as continuous, and classical fluid mechanics applies. However, as the tube gets narrower and the mean free path of the gas molecules increases, the behavior of the gas starts to deviate from classical predictions. In a sufficiently large tube, gas molecules collide frequently with one another, and the motion of the gas can be treated as a continuous fluid. The Navier-Stokes equations describe the flow of the gas with smooth velocity and pressure gradients. Knudsen flow, microscale/confined space, as the tube diameter becomes comparable to or smaller than the mean free path of the molecules, the collisions between gas molecules become less frequent. Instead of interacting with other molecules, the gas molecules begin to interact more with the walls of the tube. At this point, the discrete nature of molecular motion becomes important, and the gas behaves less like a fluid and more like a collection of independent molecules. As the gas flow transitions from the classical regime to the Knudsen regime, the traditional equations of fluid dynamics no longer apply. The key difference is that the gas molecules are now predominantly interacting with the boundary walls of the tube, rather than with each other. This change in interaction leads to a dramatic alteration in the behavior of the gas. In this regime, the Knudsen number, Kn, becomes an important parameter. The Knudsen number is defined as L/L, where L is the mean free path of the gas. Molecules, the average distance a molecule travels before colliding with another molecule, and L is the characteristic length of the system, in this case, the diameter of the tube. When the Knudsen number is small, Ny, the gas molecules are interacting primarily with each other, and classical fluid dynamics applies. When the Knudsen number is large, Ny, molecular interactions dominate and the gas behaves differently. In a typical macroscopic flow, the gas molecules frequently collide with one another, and the behavior of the gas can be described as a continuous fluid. However, in the Knudsen regime, the gas molecules are more likely to collide with the walls of the container or tube than with each other. As the molecules collide with the walls, the behavior of the gas becomes dependent on the surface properties of the container. For instance, the gas molecules may bounce off the walls in different ways, depending on the temperature, pressure, and wall material. The collisions between molecules and walls influence the overall velocity distribution of the gas. This change in behavior is particularly noticeable in microfluidic systems, where the flow of gas through narrow channels is governed by molecular dynamics rather than the usual fluid dynamics. In the Knudsen regime, the smooth gradients of velocity and pressure that we typically associate with gas flow begin to break down. Instead of a continuous, smooth flow, the gas behaves in a more discrete manner. The lack of frequent collisions between gas molecules means that the gas can no longer be modeled as a fluid in the traditional sense. One consequence of this is that the gas in the Knudsen regime often exhibits behaviors like slip flow and non-continuous velocity distributions, which are not observed in macroscopic flow. These behaviors arise because the gas is no longer in equilibrium in the traditional sense, but rather is in a state where molecular interactions dominate. In the Knudsen regime, the traditional concept of viscosity, a measure of a fluid's resistance to flow, becomes less meaningful. Since the gas molecules are interacting with the walls of the container more than with each other, the usual resistance to flow that arises from internal friction in the fluid disappears. In real-world fluids, viscosity is a key factor that resists flow. It results from the internal friction between molecules as they move past one another. However, when gas molecules move through narrow tubes, where they do not collide with each other as often, viscosity becomes negligible, and the flow behaves more like that of molecular motion rather than fluid flow. In the Knudsen regime, the phenomenon known as slip flow can occur, where the velocity of the gas molecules near the walls of the tube differs from the velocity in the interior of the flow. This is because the gas molecules near the surface are more likely to bounce off the walls than interact with other molecules in the fluid. As a result, the fluid does not flow smoothly, but instead exhibits a slip velocity at the boundary. This behavior is different from the no-slip condition we observe in typical fluid flow, where the velocity of the fluid is assumed to be zero at the wall. The Knudsen paradox is especially relevant in microfluidic systems, where the dimensions of the channels are on the order of the mean free path of the gas molecules. In such systems, the behavior of the gas flow can no longer be described by traditional fluid dynamics models. Instead, the gas must be treated as a collection of individual molecules that move through the system, interacting primarily with the walls rather than with each other. This understanding of gas behavior is crucial for the design of nanodevices, lab-on-a-chip systems, and MEMS, microelectromechanical systems, where controlling the flow of gases at a molecular level is necessary. In the study of gas transport in confined spaces, such as in tubes, capillaries, or porous materials, the Knudsen paradox plays a critical role. Researchers and engineers must account for the fact that molecular dynamics take over in small-scale systems, and traditional models of fluid dynamics need to be adjusted to include the effects of Knudsen flow. The Knudsen number becomes a key parameter when designing microfluidic devices, and understanding how gas behaves in confined spaces allows for more efficient designs in chemical reactors, microsensors, and gas filtration systems. Two-capacitor paradox. Imagine two identical capacitors, each capable of storing a certain amount of energy. At first glance, they appear to be in equal states, same size, same material, and same charge. But here's the paradox. When these two capacitors are connected in parallel or series, their behavior might not be as straightforward as expected. The two-capacitor paradox emerges when we analyze how energy is stored in each capacitor and the potential difference between them. Depending on whether they are connected in parallel or in series, the way they store and release energy can lead to counterintuitive results. How can energy be stored differently in capacitors that seem identical? Why does connecting them in parallel or series result in different energy distributions? The paradox brings into question our understanding of energy conservation, charge distribution, and potential difference in capacitors. It challenges us to reconsider how electrical circuits behave when capacitors interact with each other. Let's dive into the two-capacitor paradox, where charge, voltage, and energy behave in ways that defy our basic assumptions about electrical systems. The two-capacitor paradox stems from the fundamental principles of electrostatics and the behavior of capacitors in electrical circuits. A capacitor is a device used to store electrical energy in an electric field, consisting of two conductive plates separated by an insulating material, dielectric. The amount of energy stored in a capacitor depends on the capacitance of the device and the voltage across it. The paradox arises when capacitors are connected either in series or parallel within a circuit. In series, the voltage across each capacitor is the same, but the charge on each capacitor can be different. In parallel, the voltage across each capacitor is the same, but the charge may differ based on the individual capacitance values. The two-capacitor paradox involves a counterintuitive outcome where, despite the same initial conditions, capacitors connected in different configurations can result in unexpected energy storage and voltage distribution. This paradox emerged in the study of electrostatics and has been discussed in the context of energy conservation and capacitive reactance. While capacitors are well understood in simple circuits, their behavior when connected in complex configurations leads to paradoxical results that challenge basic electrical engineering assumptions. The paradox continues to be a useful tool for understanding the intricacies of capacitive circuits, charge redistribution, and energy dissipation in electrical systems. The two-capacitor paradox is a fascinating concept that explores how the arrangement of capacitors in a circuit affects how energy is stored and transferred. Capacitors store energy in the form of electric potential energy in their electric fields, and the relationship between charge and voltage is governed by the equation E equals 1/2CV2, where E is the energy stored in the capacitor, C is the capacitance of the capacitor, and V is the voltage across the capacitor. The paradox arises when two capacitors, initially charged, are connected either in series or parallel. Although the capacitors are identical in terms of their capacitance, the way they store and release energy in these configurations produces counterintuitive results. Let's explore the underlying principles of the paradox and why these results occur. 1. Capacitors in series. The voltage and charge distribution. A. The basics of series connection. When two capacitors are connected in series, the total capacitance of the system is given by the reciprocal sum. 1/C_total equals 1/C1 plus 1/C2. For identical capacitors, this simplifies to C_total equals C/2. In a series configuration, the charge on each capacitor is the same. This is because, in a series circuit, the current flows through both capacitors in the same direction, meaning that the charge stored on each capacitor must be identical. However, the voltage across each capacitor will not be the same. Instead, the total voltage is divided across the two capacitors, and each capacitor will have a voltage drop depending on its capacitance. For two identical capacitors connected in series, the total voltage across the system is divided evenly between the two capacitors. Thus, the voltage across each capacitor will be V1 equals V2 equals V_total/2. B. The paradox. Energy stored in a capacitor is proportional to the square of the voltage. You might intuitively think that the energy stored in each capacitor would be the same. However, because the voltage across each capacitor is halved in a series connection, the energy stored in each capacitor is lower than you might expect based on their individual capacitance. This is because the energy is not linearly related to the voltage. It's related to the square of the voltage. The total energy stored in the system is still the same as if the capacitors were in parallel, but it's divided differently between the two capacitors. In the case of two identical capacitors, the energy stored in each capacitor will be E1 equals E2 equals 1/2CV_2/2. Thus, the energy stored in each capacitor is less than expected, even though the total energy in the system remains the same. 2. Capacitors in parallel. The voltage and charge distribution. A. The basics of parallel connection. When two capacitors are connected in parallel, the voltage across both capacitors is the same, but the total charge stored in the system is the sum of the charges on the individual capacitors. The total capacitance in a parallel connection is simply the sum of the individual capacitances. C_total equals C1 plus C2. For two identical capacitors, this gives C_total equals 2C. In a parallel configuration, the voltage across each capacitor is the same. But because the capacitors have different capacitance values, the charge stored on each capacitor will be different. The charge stored each capacitor is given by Q equals CXV. Since the voltage across each capacitor is the same, the charge on each capacitor will be directly proportional to the capacitance. B. The paradox. Energy storage in parallel connection. In a parallel connection, the energy stored in each capacitor depends on both the voltage and the capacitance. Since the voltage across each capacitor is the same, but the capacitance is doubled in the total system, each capacitor stores more energy than it would in the series connection. The energy stored in each capacitor is E1 equals E2 equals 1/2 CV2. Thus, each capacitor in a parallel connection stores more energy compared to the series configuration, where the voltage is split across the capacitors. However, the paradox lies in the fact that while the energy stored in each capacitor is higher in the parallel configuration, the total energy stored in the system is still governed by the total voltage and capacitance, which can lead to counterintuitive results in how the capacitors behave when charged or discharged. 3. The paradox: energy redistribution in capacitor configurations. A. Energy conservation and redistribution. The energy paradox arises when we examine how energy is redistributed between the capacitors when they are connected in series or parallel. In both cases, the total energy stored in the system should be conserved, but the way the energy is stored in the individual capacitors can vary dramatically depending on the configuration. In the series configuration, the energy is distributed in such a way that the capacitors store less energy individually, despite the fact that the total capacitance is effectively reduced. In the parallel configuration, the energy stored in each capacitor increases because the voltage across both capacitors is the same, but the total capacitance has increased. This paradox forces us to reconsider how energy storage in electrical systems works, especially when capacitors are involved. The redistribution of energy due to the different configurations challenges our basic assumptions about how energy behaves in capacitive circuits. B. Practical implications. In real-world circuits, understanding the energy distribution between capacitors in series and parallel is crucial for designing energy storage systems, filters, and capacitive networks. The two-capacitor paradox illustrates the importance of considering both charge and voltage when designing circuits, as these two parameters interact in ways that might not be immediately intuitive. 4. Potential solutions and further questions. A. Consideration of voltage and charge. To resolve the paradox, we must carefully consider both the voltage and charge in the system. In a series configuration, while the voltage is split, the charge remains constant across each capacitor. In a parallel configuration, while the charge is split, the voltage is constant across each capacitor. The way that these factors interact in different configurations determines how the energy is distributed between the capacitors. B. The role of capacitance and circuit design. One key takeaway from the two-capacitor paradox is the importance of capacitance and circuit design in energy storage and energy dissipation. Understanding how energy is stored in capacitors and how it is redistributed based on the circuit configuration is essential for designing efficient electrical systems. Paradox of democracy. Democracy is often hailed as the ultimate system of governance, a model where the will of the majority prevails and freedom and equality are foundational principles. But what happens when the will of the majority directly undermines the rights and freedoms of the minority? The paradox of democracy poses a critical question. How can a system that prioritizes majority rule ensure the protection of minority rights? In a democracy, the majority makes decisions. But what if these decisions harm the minority or undermine individual freedoms? This paradox challenges the very heart of democratic ideals, questioning how a majoritarian system can reconcile the tension between the collective will and the individual rights. Should the majority always have the power to shape society's laws and policies? Or should certain rights be inalienable, even if the majority desires to infringe upon them? The paradox of democracy forces us to reconsider the very foundations of democratic governance, and whether true democracy can exist without a fair balance between majority rule and minority protection. Let's explore this paradox, where freedom, majority rule, and equality collide. The paradox of democracy has been a subject of philosophical debate for centuries, with early political theorists like Plato and Aristotle questioning the ideal balance between majority rule and the protection of minority rights. The tension between popular sovereignty and individual freedoms became particularly pronounced during the development of modern democratic thought, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. The paradox gained greater prominence during the American French revolutions, which championed popular democracy and the rights of man. In the United States, the question of slavery and the rights of African Americans posed a stark challenge to the democratic ideal. While the majority of white Americans in the 19th century supported slavery, the minority of enslaved people fought for their freedom, creating a fundamental paradox between democratic governance and human rights. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill and Alexis de Tocqueville contributed to the debate by emphasizing the need for protections against the tyranny of the majority. Whether in his seminal work On Liberty, Mill argued that individual freedom should be protected even against the will of the majority, advocating for limitations on majority rule when it threatens individual rights. Over time, the paradox of democracy has become central in discussions about civil rights, freedom of speech, and the limits of government power. It challenges democratic societies to consider how to achieve a just and equitable balance between the will of the majority and the rights of individuals and minority groups. The paradox of democracy is a complex issue that arises when majority rule conflicts with the protection of minority rights. In democratic systems, decisions are typically made by the majority, but the question arises, how can a system designed to protect individual freedoms and equality reconcile this with the fact that the majority can sometimes impose policies that infringe upon the rights of the minority? The paradox challenges the very principles of freedom and equality, two core ideals of democratic governance. If democracy is about empowering people to have a say in their government, then how can it also protect the rights of those who may be outnumbered or whose views are considered less popular? The paradox of democracy presents a fundamental tension that lies at the heart of political theory, the challenge of creating a system of governance that is both majoritarian and just. 1. Majority rule versus minority rights. A. The concept of majority rule. At its core, democracy is based on the idea of majority rule, where decisions are made by the collective will of the people. In democratic systems, elected officials represent the views of the majority, and the policies they enact reflect the desires of the largest portion of the population. This principle is the foundation of direct democracy and representative democracy, where elections and voting are the primary means by which individuals exercise their power. Majority rule is often seen as the most fair and equitable way to make decisions because it reflects the will of the people. In theory, majority rule ensures that no single individual or group has too much power and that policies reflect the interests of the largest number of citizens. B. The danger of the tyranny of the majority. However, the paradox of democracy arises when the majority uses its power to enact laws or policies that discriminate against or oppress minority groups. In this case, the majority may use its electoral power to limit the rights of individuals or groups who disagree with the majority's views. This can lead to a tyranny of the majority, where the political and social interests of minority groups are ignored or even actively suppressed. Historically, slavery, segregation, and discrimination against various minority groups, such as racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, as well as women and LGBTQ+ individuals, have been justified by majority rule, even though these practices were in direct conflict with the fundamental principles of equality and human rights. The civil rights movement in the United States, for example, was a direct response to this paradox, as African Americans fought for equality in a society where the majority supported segregation and disenfranchisement. The protection of minority rights. One of the central challenges in the paradox of democracy is finding a way to protect the rights of minorities while maintaining the principles of majority rule. In liberal democracies, certain fundamental rights are often enshrined in constitutions or legal frameworks to prevent the majority from infringing upon the basic freedoms of individuals or minority groups. For example, the US Constitution guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and equal protection under the law, even if the majority of the population might oppose these rights. However, in practice, the protection of minority rights is often a contested issue, with certain groups using the legal system or political activism to safeguard their freedoms against the will of the majority. This ongoing struggle highlights the tension between democracy as a system of majority rule and the need to ensure that minority groups are not oppressed or marginalized. 2. The paradox of equality and freedom. A. The principle of equality. At the heart of the paradox of democracy is the principle of equality. Democracy, at least in its ideal form, is based on the idea that all individuals are equal and should have equal rights, including the right to vote, speak, and participate in the political process. However, the reality is that certain groups may face discrimination, poverty, or marginalization, which limits their ability to participate fully in society. As a result, their political power may be diminished, and the majority may take advantage of this inequality to further suppress minority interests. The paradox here is that while equality is a cornerstone of democratic ideals, majority rule can sometimes perpetuate inequality. This is particularly true when the majority makes decisions that privilege certain groups while marginalizing others. In this sense, democracy itself may be seen as inherently unequal, as the majority is able to enforce its will even if that means limiting the freedoms of certain individuals or groups. B. The paradox of freedom. The paradox of freedom is also central to the paradox of democracy. While democracy is based on the idea that individuals should be free to express their opinions, pursue their goals, and live according to their values, these freedoms can be limited by the decisions made by the majority. In some cases, the majority may enact laws that restrict certain forms of expression, limit freedoms, or impose social norms that infringe upon individual autonomy. The freedom paradox arises when the desire for individual freedoms conflicts with the needs of the majority. For example, free speech is a core tenet of many democratic systems, but in some cases, the majority may seek to limit speech that they find offensive or dangerous. The balance between freedom and social responsibility remains one of the central challenges in modern democratic systems. 3. Solutions to the paradox of democracy. A. Constitutional safeguards and human rights. One of the main ways to address the paradox of democracy is through the establishment of constitutional safeguards and the protection of human rights. Many democratic nations, including the United States, Canada, and most of the European Union, have constitutions or charters that guarantee fundamental rights for all citizens, regardless of the will of the majority. These constitutional protections limit the ability of the majority to enact laws that violate basic rights such as freedom of speech, religion, and equal protection under the law. In this sense, the rule of law serves as a counterbalance to the tyranny of the majority. B. Deliberative democracy. Another approach to resolving the paradox of democracy is the concept of deliberative democracy, which emphasizes the importance of public deliberation and dialogue in decision-making. In a deliberative democracy, decisions are made not just based on majority opinion, but through open debate, reasoning, and discussion about what is in the best interest of all citizens, particularly marginalized groups. Deliberative democracy seeks to ensure that all voices are heard and that the minority viewpoint is given consideration in the decision-making process. This approach encourages a more inclusive and equitable form of democracy, where compromise and reasoned discussion are prioritized over simple majority rule. C. Representation and electoral systems. To address the paradox of democracy, electoral systems can be designed to ensure more equitable representation of diverse viewpoints. For example, systems like proportional representation allow for more minority representation in the legislature, ensuring that smaller groups have a say in the democratic process, even if they do not represent the majority of the population. This can help reduce the marginalization of certain groups and ensure that democratic governance is more reflective of the diversity and complexity of society. 4. Conclusion: reconciling majority rule and minority rights. A. Balancing power in a democracy. Premise maker highlights the ongoing tension between majority rule and the protection of minority rights. The challenge of creating a democratic system that is just, inclusive, and equitable lies in balancing the will of the majority with the need to safeguard the rights and freedoms of individuals and minority groups. B. Embracing pluralism and justice. To resolve the paradox, democratic societies must embrace the principles of pluralism, justice, and human rights. While majority rule is a foundational principle of democracy, it must be accompanied by mechanisms that protect minority voices, ensure equal representation, and uphold individual freedoms. This balance is essential for ensuring that democracy remains a system that serves all people, not just the majority. Paradox of toil. Imagine that you are told that saving money is one of the best ways to secure your financial future. So you tighten your belt, cut back on spending, and put more into your savings account. Sounds like a responsible choice, right? But here's the paradox. If everyone starts saving more and cutting back on spending, it can lead to a slower economy, fewer jobs, and lower wages, ultimately hurting everyone's ability to save in the long run. This is the paradox of thrift, a concept in economics where individual efforts to save more can, paradoxically, lead to a decrease in overall savings and economic decline. The more people try to save money, the less money there is circulating in the economy, which can lead to reduced business profits, lower incomes, and even higher unemployment. This paradox challenges the traditional wisdom that saving is always beneficial. How can it be that the very act of saving, something that seems to benefit the individual, can actually harm the collective economy? Let's explore the paradox of thrift, where individual financial prudence collides with the larger forces of aggregate demand and economic stability. The paradox of thrift was first introduced by the British economist John Maynard Keynes in his seminal work The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, 1936. Keynes argued that while saving is generally a prudent financial behaviour for individuals, it can have negative effects on the national economy when everyone engages in it simultaneously. Keynes developed this idea during the Great Depression, a period of economic downturn that highlighted the disconnect between individual saving behaviour and overall economic health. During the Depression, many individuals and businesses attempted to save more money to weather the uncertain economic climate. However, this collective increase in savings led to a decrease in consumer spending, which in turn reduced aggregate demand for goods and services. As demand fell, businesses struggled to make profits, leading to wage cuts, layoffs, and a further decline in economic activity. The paradox of thrift specifically points out that increased saving by individuals can reduce overall economic activity and cause a vicious cycle where the economy contracts, making it harder for people to save in the first place. It essentially asks the question, can the collective effort of individuals to save money actually harm the economy? This paradox became a key element in Keynesian economics, which advocates for government intervention to stimulate demand when the private sector is reluctant to spend or invest. The paradox of thrift is a fundamental concept in Keynesian economics, illustrating the conflict between individual financial behaviour and the larger economy. While saving is typically seen as a responsible and prudent action for individuals, the paradox reveals how widespread increased saving in a population can harm economic growth. 1. The basic concept of the paradox of thrift. A. The relationship between savings and aggregate demand. In Keynesian economics, aggregate demand is the total demand for goods and services within an economy at a given overall price level and in a given period. It is composed of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Consumption represents a significant portion of this demand as people spend money on goods and services. When individuals increase their savings, they typically reduce their consumption. In theory, this should be a good thing for personal financial health. However, when everyone tries to save more at the same time, overall demand for goods and services decreases. Businesses then face reduced sales and profits, which often leads to cutbacks in production, layoffs, and wage reductions. As these factors accumulate, economic activity slows, leading to an overall reduction in national income. In simple terms, the paradox is that while saving more is beneficial for the individual in the short term, saving more collectively can lower the overall income levels in the economy, reducing the amount of money available for future saving and spending. B. The vicious cycle of the paradox. The paradox creates a vicious cycle in the economy. As individual saving increases, aggregate demand falls, which leads to a reduction in business profits, higher unemployment, and wage cuts. This, in turn, reduces people's ability to save because their income is lower. As a result, the initial desire to save more leads to a situation where less money is available for individuals to save. This cycle is especially dangerous during economic downturns, such as recessions or depressions, when businesses and consumers are already struggling. The paradox of thrift highlights how macroeconomic behaviour is different from microeconomic behaviour. While it is prudent for an individual to save for financial security, if everyone does the same thing simultaneously, it undermines the broader economic health. 2. The historical context and relevance of the paradox. A. The Great Depression and Keynesian economics. The paradox of thrift gained prominence during the Great Depression, when the US and many other countries faced severe economic contractions. At this time, Keynes argued that the traditional view of saving as inherently positive needed to be re-evaluated. While saving helps individuals maintain financial security, in a depressed economy, too much saving leads to reduced consumption, which reduces economic activity. Keynes suggested that, in such a scenario, the government should intervene to stimulate demand through public works and government spending. This would offset the reduction in demand caused by decreased consumer spending and help prevent the economy from spiraling further downward. Keynesian economics thus emphasizes the need for demand stimulation during periods of economic downturn. This is in contrast to classical economic theories, which argue that the economy will naturally correct itself over time if left alone. According to Keynes, in times of recession, the government must intervene by increasing public spending or cutting taxes to boost aggregate demand and stimulate economic growth. B. The modern application of the paradox. While the paradox of thrift was originally discussed in the context of the Great Depression, it remains relevant today. In modern economies, particularly those with high levels of consumer debt and unemployment, the paradox continues to illustrate the tension between individual financial responsibility and the collective economic health. For instance, during the 2008 financial crisis, many governments around the world enacted stimulus packages to encourage consumer spending and prevent a prolonged recession. These measures were rooted in the idea that when the private sector is unwilling to spend due to economic uncertainty, the government must step in to boost demand. The paradox remains especially important in understanding recessions and economic slowdowns, periods when consumers are more likely to cut back on spending and increase saving, exacerbating the economic decline. 3. Key mechanisms behind the paradox. A. The marginal propensity to consume. MPC. One of the key elements that underpins the paradox of thrift is the concept of the marginal propensity to consume, MPC, which measures the proportion of additional income that is spent on consumption rather than saved. In economies where the MPC is high, a significant portion of income is spent on goods and services, fueling aggregate demand. When people decide to save more, the MPC decreases, meaning less money is spent on consumption and less is pumped into the economy. The MPC is a crucial factor in understanding how changes in individual saving behavior can impact overall economic activity. If too many people try to save simultaneously, aggregate demand falls, leading to slower economic growth and potentially higher unemployment. B. The role of investment. Investment is another key factor in the paradox. When consumer spending decreases, businesses may find themselves with excess inventory and lower profits, prompting them to cut back on investment. Since investment is a critical driver of economic growth, a reduction in business investment further deepens the economic slowdown. A decrease in business investment can have long-lasting effects on the economy, leading to lower productivity growth, fewer job opportunities, and an overall deterioration in economic conditions. This is why demand stimulation, either through private investment or public spending, is crucial in mitigating the paradox of thrift. 4. Implications for government policy, fiscal stimulus, and public spending. One of the major implications of the paradox of thrift is the need for government intervention during times of economic slowdown. When the private sector pulls back from spending and saving increases, the government can play a pivotal role by increasing public spending or cutting taxes to encourage consumption. In practice, fiscal stimulus measures such as infrastructure investment, subsidies for consumer goods, or direct cash transfers can help counteract the negative effects of increased saving. By stimulating demand, the government can prevent the economy from entering a vicious cycle of reduced consumption and stagnation. B. The need for balanced fiscal policies. While stimulating demand is crucial during a recession, it is also important for governments to maintain a balanced approach to fiscal policy. Over-reliance on debt-financed public spending can lead to future financial instability. Thus, the key challenge is to balance short-term stimulus efforts with long-term economic sustainability. Effective fiscal policies should aim to encourage economic growth without contributing to unsustainable debt levels that could harm future generations. 5. The paradox of saving in a global context. A. Global savings and economic imbalances. The paradox of thrift also has implications in the global context. As some countries, such as China, have high levels of savings, they often rely on exporting goods to countries like the United States, where consumers tend to have a low savings rate and a higher consumption rate. This global imbalance between savings and spending can lead to economic inequality and create challenges in balancing the world economy. For instance, countries with high levels of savings may accumulate large amounts of foreign exchange reserves, but they may also face domestic demand stagnation due to a lack of consumption. On the other hand, countries with high levels of debt and low savings may face long-term economic challenges as their external debts increase while internal consumption remains high. B. Global economic stimulus. The paradox of thrift is thus not only a national issue but a global economic challenge. As countries around the world attempt to increase savings to weather financial uncertainty, they may unintentionally reduce global aggregate demand, leading to slower global economic growth. Understanding this paradox is essential for formulating policies that can foster global cooperation and economic stability. The Petersburg Paradox. Imagine you're presented with a coin flip game where you can win an exponentially increasing amount of money based on how many flips it takes for the coin to land on heads. The more flips, the higher the reward. Yet, paradoxically, most people would only be willing to pay a small fee to enter this game, despite its potential to offer an enormous payout. This is the essence of the St. Petersburg Paradox, a classic problem in probability theory and economics. The game offers an infinite expected value, yet human behavior shows that people are risk-averse and don't value the game nearly as much as the mathematical model suggests. Why do we consistently undervalue high expected value scenarios with large risks? The paradox highlights the conflict between mathematical expectations and real-world decision-making, forcing us to consider how humans perceive value and risk differently than the abstract math might suggest. Let's explore the St. Petersburg Paradox, where expected value, human behavior, and decision theory collide in a puzzling contradiction that reveals the complexities of rationality, risk-taking, and the limits of mathematical models in real-world scenarios. The St. Petersburg Paradox was introduced by the Swiss mathematician Daniel Bernoulli in 1738 as part of his work on probability theory and utility theory. The paradox was framed around a coin flip game in which the player would flip a coin repeatedly until they got a head. The payoff for the game would start at $2 for the first flip, double with each successive flip, $4 for the second flip, $8 for the third, and so on, theoretically continuing infinitely. The expected value of the game, which is calculated by multiplying the probability of each outcome by the prize, suggests that the expected payout approaches infinity. But mathematically this should make the game worth an infinite amount of money. However, when Bernoulli presented this paradox, he noted that no one would be willing to pay an astronomical sum to participate in such a game, highlighting the disparity between theoretical expectations and human decision-making. This disconnect between theoretically optimal choices and actual choices led Bernoulli to introduce the concept of utility theory, which suggested that people make decisions based on the marginal utility of money, not its raw value. This was a key development in the foundations of modern economics, influencing the field of decision theory and behavioral economics. The St. Petersburg Paradox continues to be a central topic of discussion in probability theory, economics, and philosophy, challenging our understanding of rationality, risk, and value. The St. Petersburg Paradox presents a problem that combines elements of probability theory, economics, and human psychology. It illustrates a situation where mathematical models predict an infinite expected value for a game of chance, but actual human behavior reveals a much lower valuation of the game. The paradox is critical because it exposes the limits of expected value as a useful tool for understanding human decision-making and challenges traditional notions of rationality in economic theory. 1. The mechanics of the St. Petersburg game. A. The structure of the game. The game is structured as follows. A coin is flipped repeatedly until heads appears. The prize for the first flip, if it is heads, is $2. If the first flip is tails, the second flip is conducted, and the prize for this flip is $4, and so on. The prize doubles with each successive flip, and the number of flips needed before heads occurs is random. Mathematically, the expected value of the game is calculated as the sum of the probabilities of all possible outcomes multiplied by the prize associated with each outcome. The expected value formula for the game is E equals 1/2x2 plus 1/4x4 plus 1/8x8 plus 1/16x16 plus The sum of this infinite series is infinite, which suggests that the mathematical expectation of the game is infinite. B. Calculating the expected value. The calculation above is based on geometric series, where the expected value of the game can be derived from the following: e equals n equals 1 to 1/2 to the power of n. X term represents the probability of the game ending at the nth flip, with heads, multiplied by the prize. The series sums to infinity, suggesting that, based purely on mathematical probability, the game should be worth an unlimited amount of money. The paradox arises from the disconnect between this infinite expected value and the fact that most people would not be willing to pay large sums, even millions of dollars, to participate in the game. 2. The disconnect between expected value and human behavior. A. Risk aversion and marginal utility. The crux of the St. Petersburg paradox lies in the concept of risk aversion, which is the tendency for individuals to prefer certainty over uncertainty, even if the uncertain outcome offers a higher expected value. This aversion to risk makes people less willing to pay a large sum for a game that has a potentially infinite payout, but also a high degree of uncertainty. In traditional utility theory, people are assumed to make decisions based on the marginal utility of money, not its absolute value. Utility is the subjective value individuals place on money, which diminishes as they acquire more wealth. This concept was first introduced by Daniel Bernoulli to explain why people undervalue high expected value games like the St. Petersburg game. For instance, if an individual already has a certain amount of money, the utility they gain from $100, 0 cents, is much less than the utility gained from the first $100, 0 cents they ever earn. This diminishing marginal utility means that $1,000, 0 cents, may not be perceived as 10 times more valuable than $100, 0 cents, as it does not provide as much satisfaction. In the context of the St. Petersburg paradox, the large sums of money offered by the game are less appealing than the expected value suggests, because they are seen as less useful in the context of personal utility. B. Human valuation of risk. The paradox reveals that humans do not make decisions based purely on expected value, but instead weigh risks and uncertainties against their personal utility. When confronted with the St. Petersburg game, people will underestimate the value of the large payouts because of the uncertainty of the game. The potential of winning an enormous amount of money is often discounted because the odds of achieving it are so small. Most individuals would rather avoid the risk and accept a more moderate payoff with a higher probability. This behavior is consistent with the broader principle of risk aversion, where people prefer smaller but more certain rewards to larger, more uncertain ones. It also explains why insurance markets and pension funds exist. People are willing to pay to eliminate risk, even when the expected outcome suggests that the risk is relatively low. 3. The paradox of utility and rationality. A. Human psychology versus mathematical models. The St. Petersburg paradox forces us to reconsider the role of rationality in decision-making. While traditional economic theory assumes that individuals will act rationally by maximizing expected value, the paradox shows that human behavior does not always align with the predictions of mathematical models. If humans were purely rational and utility maximizing, they would be willing to pay significant amounts to play the St. Petersburg game, given the game's infinite expected value. Yet, in reality, people are consistently unwilling to wager large sums on this game. This discrepancy between the theoretical model and actual behavior challenges the assumption that humans always make decisions based purely on logical reasoning and expected outcomes. The role of behavioral economics. The St. Petersburg paradox has had significant implications for the development of behavioral economics, a field that studies how psychological, social, and emotional factors influence economic decision-making. Behavioral economists argue that individuals often make decisions based on factors like cognitive biases, emotions, and social influences, rather than strictly adhering to the rational choice model proposed by classical economics. In light of the paradox, researchers in behavioral economics emphasize the importance of subjective value, perception of risk, and psychological preferences when explaining economic decision-making. The study of risk aversion, loss aversion, and prospect theory has expanded our understanding of how people navigate uncertainty and make decisions in real-world scenarios. 4. Practical implications and applications. A. Real-world applications of expected value. Despite the paradox, expected value remains a cornerstone of probability theory and economic decision-making. It is used to evaluate a wide range of financial and investment decisions, from lotteries to insurance to stock market trading. However, the St. Petersburg Paradox teaches us that real-world decision-making often diverges from purely mathematical models, highlighting the need to account for psychological factors when analyzing behavior. B. Rethinking risk and reward. The St. Petersburg Paradox also underscores the importance of understanding how people perceive risk. This has practical implications for areas like game theory, market behavior, and policy design, where decision-makers must account for human tendencies toward risk aversion and uncertainty. Policymakers, financial analysts, and business leaders must understand that people often undervalue high-reward opportunities that involve great risks, and adjust strategies accordingly.